Welcome, dear reader. Not a fantasy connoisseur or a fine scholar. Oh, right, you're one of those. The kind who clicks 18 plus mature and scrolls past the warning labels. Good, you'll definitely fit right in. So, let's start from scratch. Welcome, dear pervert reader. First of all, let's meet our protagonist. The man, the myth, the Gooning legend. The very man who is said to have masturbated 11 hours straight in a single day, breaking the world record. Not that anyone in the world knows. Actually, it's our MC who is a bit too low-key and doesn't want to tell the world his great deeds, humility and modesty stuff. Where is he right now? Not in a classroom, not at a job, not outside touching grass. Oh, there he is, in his degenerate heaven, hunched over like a cryptid in the glow of a dying monitor. Eyes red from another all-night marathon of smut web novels, and halfway between enlightenment and digital decay, his fingers tapping away feverishly as he chases endless pixels and strokes of erotic prose. As for the state of his room, curtains, of course, tightly shut, closed, air stale, filled with musky smell, old-ass fan rattling, probably begging for mercy. And of course his computer, the only light source, something we all can relate, but man, even it looks tired of him. If monks sought nirvana through meditation, this guy's chasing it through cultured content. Anyways, lo and behold, a modern monk of the web, devoted to the sacred art of gooning. Everything aside, he's currently 24 and running on, yes, you have guessed it right, instant noodles, caffeine, and pure denial. Still studying, technically, though it's hard to call it that when his GPA is flatter than his social life. His poor degree is dragging its broken body toward year 6, still begging to be finished. As for what the degree is about, who knows, at least I don't. But man, just like us, his whole life is an ecosystem of neglect, half-eaten noodles, tabs of web novels, forgotten ambitions moldering in the corner, and of course, a generous layer of existential dread coating everything. Every night unknowingly bleeds into the next, a loop of scrolling, and occasionally wondering where it all went wrong before going right back to scrolling. As for family, barely sees them. Friends, long faded into online ghosts. And relationships, the last real conversation he had with a woman was when his fat landlady asked for rent while munching like a cow. As for the appearance part, one of the most important aspects of human society, well, honestly, he's not ugly, just normal. If he cleaned up a bit, hit the gym, maybe remembered what sunlight felt like, and maybe, just maybe, smiled like a functioning human being, yeah, he could probably get a girlfriend. But that sounds like effort. And effort is for people who still believe things get better. So, like us, he doesn't even bother. Anyways, for him 2D is always better than real flesh and blood. No expectations, no drama, no awkward texting at 3 a.m., and no breakup playlists. Just pixels, storylines, and endless fantasies. Well, it seems this dude's got a classic case of existential dread, or more simplified depression with no apparent cause. Or maybe there is, but he doesn't know. That's how scary the depression really is. He doesn't have a tragic backstory, no heartbreaking breakup, at least not enough to succumb to poetry or classic literature, so yeah, definitely not heartbreaking enough. As for a villain origin moment, nope, nothing like that too. So, it's definitely just the universe doing what it does best. Quietly screwing with you for no discernible cause. Honestly, from the outside, his life doesn't even look half bad. He's got a roof, Wi-Fi, food, technically, and enough health to complain about it online. But on the inside, it's like someone left him on low battery mode permanently. Everything works, but nothing feels worth using, and dying internally without any rhyme or reason. Maybe it's his lack of motivation. Maybe it's all those self-destructive habits that have led him down a dangerous path. One where his only solace comes from the boundary-pushing content he devours. Or just like us, it's just growing up and finally understanding the true face of the world. Realizing it's just all manipulated shit, your dreams were just slogans to keep you obedient, and no matter how hard you try, the only ones to benefit are those already rich fuckers. While you are grinding 24/7 just to afford your next meal, those fuckers are raining shit ton of money on drinking pooped coffee and shitting on gold toilets. Anyways, fuck world, fuck society, Fuck therapists and their symptom-based roleplay. He's beyond all that. Anyways, instead of living in this shitty world, operated by their rules, he'd rather rebel and live in fantasy worlds. You know the ones where every protagonist gets a harem by chapter 10 and builds an empire by chapter 30. At least, he can get some sense of achievement through the MC and his daydreams. Ahem. Back to the topic. Oh, it seems our hero is about to reach the climax. Both figuratively and literally, today he's been gooning to a civilization-building smut novel. You know the type. The protagonist transmigrates to a primitive world, starts from zero, builds kingdoms, tames tribes, collects women like Pokemon, every gooner's favorite fantasy. And as he read, his hands trembled not figuratively, for real, as he struggled to focus, due to not sleeping for the past 2 or maybe 3 days, and his body aching from a 20-hour fast in dedication to his impending virtual conquest. With a surge of excitement, he rapidly scrolled down as he finally reached a pivotal scene, which he had been waiting for, where the protagonist finally claimed his female lead, which this shitty writer had been delaying for hundreds of chapters. He urged the MC along the line, not that it mattered. Fuck her now, lick her armpits, fill her pussy. Yeah now. But, alas, just as the story reaches its climax, unfortunately, so does our MC's story in this world too. As he was busy stroking his already bruised cock, suddenly he felt a sharp pain. A weird, twisting pain right in the chest. First, he ignored it. Probably hunger, he thought. He hasn't eaten since yesterday? Maybe the day before? Who cares? But the pain didn't stop. It deepened, crawled up his arm, face and shoulders, tightening like a hand gripping around his heart. No, it was more like an elephant jumping on his heart. The screen started swimming around like he was on some cheap-ass drug. Suddenly, an inexplicable thought struck him. Is this the infamous heart attack he's heard about? His thoughts slowly started getting foggy and consciousness began to slip away. But instead of death, he was concerned about something else. His raging climax and the cold-face heroine getting impaled. Really coming for me at the worst possible moment? He couldn't help complain helplessly, as he tried hard to focus on screen to at least read the scenes he had been waiting for. When the MC's cock finally penetrated deep into the hot pussy of the cold, high and mighty female main character bitch. His own cock was raging like a mighty heavenly dragon, just waiting for just a single stroke to unleash its fury and paint the world, sealing white. But unfortunately, it was all in vain, as it became harder and harder to focus. Wait, am I really dying? He laughs. Wheezes, actually, even though he had already made peace with him dying suddenly due to his lifestyle, the thought still felt a bit absurd. He thought he would at least live up to become a balding perverted uncle or maybe finish the One Piece, if the author ever decided to end it. And you can't just die while gooning, right? Right? Well, suddenly there was another pang of pain, as if to tell him that yes you can. His left hand jerks off the mouse, as he couldn't help grabbing his chest due to sheer intensity of pain. No, not now, he wheezes. At least let me come. I had been waiting for this fucking moment for past 20 hours. Fuck you author for dragging this so long, and fuck you God for choosing this time. As if angered by his cursing, the pain further intensified and his breath shortened. His monitor blurred into dreamy soft lines. He tried to stand to somehow ease the pain, at least temporarily. But of course, fails miserably and stumbles over, knocking over an artistic array of empty cans, and finally collapses back into his chair. With twitching fingers, he tried to focus hard and barely stared at the screen, at the open tabs, the questionable file names, the accumulation of absolute darkness of humanity. Finally accepting his impending demise, he slumped and seeing the open tabs, a sudden thought stuck to him. Hard drive. At least, gotta clear the drive. It's not guilt or anything. It's instinct. He had lived online too long to die with his search history and files intact. So, forget the last words of wisdom, forget redemption arcs. The only thing that truly matters in this moment is data management, or more specifically data deletion. With this thought, he moved all his strength from the dick to his hand, and somehow got enough strength to drag the mouse with a trembling hand, and clicked one last shortcut. opening his proudest creation, his magnum opus of paranoia, Gooner Cleanup Shortcut, cleanup.exe, a single command to delete everything, incriminating in one go. He barely moves his finger. Click, and done. Clean slate, digital baptism complete. One final act of dignity. And then, everything faded away. The screen flickers once, twice, and ultimately dies as the CPU overloads due to the command and literally burns to erase any hope of data recovery forever. Finally, his body slumps. The chair creaks eerily. And the last thought that crosses his brain before shutting down completely? Thank God I made that shortcut. And then, finally silence. Complete silence. No harps, no angels. No reapers. Not even a tunnel of light waiting to escort him to the afterlife. Only darkness. Heavy, endless, velvety darkness. And what follows is absolute. A void untouched, where no light dares to enter, and no hope can ever break through. Yet, deep within this void, a spark of life still flickers. A soul floats aimlessly through the void, detached from flesh, time, regret, and more importantly, lust. Tiny, stubborn, refusing to die like the last ember of a cigarette crushed under a shoe. No matter how hard you stomp, it still definitely flickers. It wanders between universes like a broken Wi-Fi signal, searching for meaning where none exists, or maybe just come. He drifts, and drifts. There was no up or down or any direction, just eternal void. Could have been seconds, decades, or centuries. Who knows? Time's got no meaning here, just like when we are on a quest to find Gooning materials. Then, suddenly, something tears through the void. A soundless explosion of light. A streak. White hot. Not that white hot. Divine. Blinding. Like the universe itself just said, yeah, we're not done with this Gooning legend yet. It cuts through the endless dark and accidentally slams straight into that lonely, drifting speck that used to be a man. For a moment, even the void shudders. The soul spasm and the darkness screams without sound. And just like that, begins the legend of a man who died mid-goon. Ag! My head hurts. Suddenly a 17 or 18-year-old young man opened his eyes. He blinked slowly, trying to figure out what the heck was going on. And the first thing he noticed beside tearing headache? Massive boobus. Like really massive. The biggest he had seen in his whole life. Straining against the barely covering animal hide of her loincloth, threatening to spill forth at any given moment. Okay, he thought weakly. I'm alive, I think. Maybe. Either that or hell's gone rustic. Because there's no way these massive boobus can exist in reality. And just as he was entranced, staring at the boobus, a pleasant musky scent assaulted his nose mixture of some unknown flowers and body odors which instead of being unpleasant was very pleasant and strangely arousing. He tried to move, but alas, he was too weak to even move around and could only move his eyes around. He looked down and found himself almost naked except for a tanned animal hide loincloth covering his groin area. Looking at this tanned fit and athletic body, he suddenly felt something wrong, like something was definitely not right, as his body was definitely not this fit. As a senior cultured man, an almost absurd thought suddenly struck his mind, that this was definitely not his original body. But before he could think anything further, suddenly a cracking voice entered his ears. Ah, soul, why you finally woke up, I had already told you, you are still too young to go hunting, B, but you still didn't listen. Sob, sob. He was dumbstruck and didn't know what to say. So he just stared helplessly, trying to figure out what was going on. The busted woman continued. Why you? You don't know how worried I was. Saying that, she started sobbing even harder. Sob, sob. Seeing you unconscious at that time. I really thought that I lost you. Sob. Seeing her cry like this, he couldn't help feeling a sense of pity. But the main fucking problem was he didn't know who the heck she was, or why she was calling him soul. It was definitely not his name, even though he thought like that, back in the depth of his mind. There seemed to be a faint inkling, and combined with this weirdly athletic body and primitive surroundings, that faint feeling grew even further. But he didn't have time to think further, as the woman wiped her tears and leaned forward. so much that it really felt that those massive mounds would break free any moment and assault him. Not that he minded. Unknowing of his degenerate thoughts, the woman looked at him concerningly. "Are you all right, soul? Why aren't you speaking?" Reluctantly lifting his eyes from those boobas, he finally had a better look at this smoking hot woman, or more accurately a MILF. The sultry woman before him was the very vision of primal sensuality. Her long, dark hair stumbled down her back in enticing waves, providing a tantalizing frame for a face that seemed both soft and strong at once, and seemed to be chiseled from the primal earth itself, a testament to her unbridled vitality and fierce spirit. Her piercing emerald eyes, alight with a gentle warmth, met the young man's dazed gaze as she leaned in. Her full, juicy lips, that seemed stained with the juice of a ripe berry, curved into a tender expression of concern as she reached out to caress his sweat-dampened face. Her tan skin on that streamlined body glistened with a light sheen of sweat, the musky scent of sun-kissed skin, earth, and primal allure of women wafted from the MILF, and impacted on his awakening desires. And the touch from her electrifying hands seemed to promise ease and forbidden pleasures alike, awakening a hunger in him that threatened to consume him whole. As she leaned in, the heat of her body, the very essence of her being, reverberated through him, further fanning the flames of his desire into an all-consuming inferno. Just when he felt that he was about to lose it all, the ever-present headache strengthened further, awakening him from her allure, and promptly switched on his upper brain again. As he came back to sense, looking at her and the surroundings, he couldn't help mutter, "What am I? Where am I? And most importantly, who is this smoking hot MILF? This woman?" Just as this thought emerged, a sharp pain filled his head, so intense that he just wished to pass out. But his brain refused to comply and stayed wide awake, letting him thoroughly enjoy the pain. He tried to roll around to ease the pain, but his body refused to listen, so he could only helplessly shut his eyes in pain. It was like thousands of needles poking his head at once, various fragments of memory continuing to drift in his mind, and he knew that they were definitely not his own. Seeing him like this, the woman was startled and cried out in alarm, "Soul! Soul! What's wrong? Don't frighten me like this." Seemingly thinking of something, she hurried out of what you can call was a thatched hut, as it was patched together with wood, hay, and animal leather. On the other hand, after what felt like an eternity, the pain finally began to subside. Not totally disappear, just loosen its grip enough to allow him to at last breath again. A rapid, ragged exhale tore out of his lungs, as he tried to catch his breath again. By now his whole body was drenched in sweat. Every muscle throbbed like it had been cooked over an open fire. His mildly tanned skin flushed crimson, veins still pulsing from whatever cosmic crap he'd just gone through. He stared up at the ceiling, chest rising and falling, heartbeat still pounding like an old engine that refused to die. Exhale. The sound was half relief, half disbelief. For a long second he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even think, just stared blankly. His brain was still buffering reality. Then, slowly, like a half-corrupted file trying to reload, the memories started coming back. Fragmented, glitchy, and completely out of order. And with that, he finally remembered who he was, where he was, and most importantly, what the hell was happening. He looked at the roof above him with a complicated expression, because it was not concrete or plaster, instead it was all straw and hay. A thatched roof, uneven and patched like it was built by someone drunk. Sunlight entered through the window like openings in the walls, warm and golden, landing across his sweaty face. Suddenly, he frowned, and a helpless expression etched on his face, the corner of his mouth twitching like he couldn't decide if he should laugh or panic. "You've really got to be kidding me," he muttered as he didn't know whether to say it was his good luck or bad luck. Even though he had a bit of inkling, but when it was really confirmed, it still felt so absurd that for a second, he genuinely thought this was some post-death fever dream. But no, everything felt too real. The rough bedding scratching his skin, the faint smell of ash and dirt, the slow hum of insects outside, everything was undoubtedly real. He tried to sit up, but every bone in his body protested, making his face pale with pain. So he gave up and tried to feel his new body, as his body felt really. different, lighter and weirdly raw, like a system reboot running on new hardware. He took another breath, stared at his trembling hands, and finally let out a small, shaky laugh. But what he didn't realize, or more like what he couldn't realize with his mortal senses, was that he wasn't alone. In the darkest corner of the hut, where the shadows clung to the thatch like oil, a distortion lingered. It wasn't a ghost or some evil beast, but a mere projection, a fragment of consciousness from a being far too powerful to physically descend into this fragile plane without causing massive destruction. It was her, the entity who had been warring across the plains for months or maybe years. She watched the boy with a heavy sense of responsibility. She remembered the moment he died. She had been locked in combat with a void tyrant. Feeling something strange, the boy had simply looked up, a witness to a war he couldn't see or comprehend. But the tyrant had noticed him. To that cruel being, a mortal gaze was an insult in itself. With a casual flick of a finger, like a man swatting a gnat, the tyrant had sent a pulse of death down to erase the pesky ant. Seeing this, she had hurriedly struck back, and ironically this gave her a rare chance to catch tyrant distracted, and using her full power, she used that moment to kill him. But the damage was done. The boy had fallen, his soul shattered by the casual malice of a higher being. Guilt-ridden, she had descended a portion of her consciousness. She refused to let an innocent die for merely witnessing her war. So, seeing him dying, she had gritted her teeth and used a last resort. She had poured a drop of divine origin essence, a priceless treasure that immortals slaughtered each other for, into his body, willing his heart to beat again, commanding his broken soul to repair. But what even she didn't know was that the original soul had already obliterated instantly, the moment the tyrant took action, and by some weird coincidence of fate, new soul from another universe had slipped into the vacuum just as her essence took root. And now finally watching Soul get up, see his chest rise and fall, and see the divine origin essence fusing with his bones, body and soul, rewriting his potential from mortal to something limitless. She let out a silent, metaphysical sigh of relief. He lives. The presence echoed silently. My debt is paid, and that essence will rebuild him, stronger than any mortal has the right to be. She looked at him with complicated emotions, as she hadn't expected one of the world's most valuable things to eventually fall in this mortal's hand. But she didn't have any regrets, as she couldn't go against her consciousness, which will be even worse for her, and most importantly, he gave her a chance to kill Void Tyrant, which deserves a much more valuable reward than this one. She lingered for one last second, ensuring the integration was stable. Satisfied that the boy was saved, she dissolved into mist, retreating back to higher planes, leaving behind no trace of her existence. Soul suddenly shivered. A phantom sensation brushed against his chest, like a cool, elegant hand lifting off his sternum. He blinked, looking around the empty room. Is anyone there? Silence answered him. But as he inhaled, a strange, impossible scent hit his nose. It wasn't the smell of mud or sickness. It was the scent of frost and blue lotuses, crisp, elegant, regal, and entirely out of place in a primitive tribe. He rubbed his chest, right over his heart, feeling a strange, humming warmth buried deep inside. Weird, he muttered, dismissing the scent as a hallucination from the pain. Anyways, I guess I really respawned, he muttered helplessly. Anyway, his name is Soul. Just Soul, nothing else. No last name. No middle name, just a short, simple word that apparently meant son, as his parents said that he looked like a little sun when he was born. Bright, warm, full of life, and wanted the sun to bless him, protect him, guide him. So they simply named him Soul, meaning sun. Yes, the names in this era are just so casual. Cute story. But at least the name was good enough. And as you already know, our boy here is a proud transmigrator. Yes, that same cliché trope. Not that it's something rare or to be proud of anymore. Honestly, it's about as impressive as owning a cracked phone, embarrassing but still usable. Because transmigrators these days are as rare as roadside, exactly, they are fucking everywhere, Every second novel has a transmigrator these days. In fact, whole libraries of web novels are filled with them. Every third protagonist wakes up with divine bloodlines, infinite systems, or 10 wives waiting in line for his reincarnated ass. It's gotten so bad that half the readers like you just close the tab the moment they see the words. I woke up in another world. But still, here he is. Another one. Another poor bastard who died in the dumbest way possible and somehow got Isekai'd instead of deleted. The real catch though? It's not the reincarnation part. Where he ended up. Because this isn't one of those fancy magical kingdoms, or sci-fi empires, settings where you wake up as a noble or a prince or even a peasant with a system or some absurd cheat. No, he got sent to a primitive world. And not the loincloths and stone huts, kind you see in lazy fantasy stories. We're talking about prehistoric. The actual Paleolithic era. For those of you who skipped school or bunked out like me, that's the time when humans weren't building nations. They were busy trying not to get eaten by something with fur, claws, and a big-ass stomach. There could be tribes, spears, and fire, if you were lucky, and be all alone in a cave if unlucky. The life here was about hunting, bleeding, someone dying, and then repeating it all again. There were no concrete houses, no metal, no farming, no Wi-Fi, no anime, no smut novels, and no civilization, period. Just endless prehistoric forests, towering beasts, and nature that didn't give a single damn whether you lived or died. So yeah, transmigrator or not, Soul wasn't exactly feeling like a chosen one right now. Because he wasn't reborn as a tribal chief or some hidden genius, or even a hunter with a special system host, at least not yet, as he really hasn't heard any ding. He was just a guy dropped into the prehistoric version of hell, breathing smoke and dirt, surrounded by a world that wanted him dead before breakfast. He exhaled again, voice raspy and dry. Great. Out of all the timelines, I get the one where humans are just snacks. Reaching here, his internal monologue was stopped abruptly because that smoking hot MILF was back. And this time with another equally ravishing MILF with white hair, not older people white, more like naturally whitish silver color. These two stunning women, radiating an unmistakable aura of mature allure, re-entered his line of sight. The first, undoubtedly an empress of curves, walking definition of red-hot desire. But his gaze was equally captivated by the second one. She was a vision of icy elegance contrasting beautifully with her flawless, porcelain complexion. A perfect canvas for her impeccable soft features. Even though her boobus may have lacked the exaggerated proportions of her predecessor, but there was still a raw, unforgettable appeal to her curves that sent shivers down his spine. But that is not the main point. The main issue was it was only now that he truly focused on their attire. The provocative attire they wore that truly captured his imagination. Shredded animal hides and supple wood fibers loincloth clung to their lithe frames. A precarious balance of coverage and lascivious exposure. Even though they weren't revealing much, but compared to modern attires, they left little to the imagination. Flaunting toned bellies, long, lean limbs, and delicate arms in an overt display of primal, carnal beauty. Even, the air seemed to thicken with anticipation as these two goddesses emerged. Their presence seemed to be a siren's call to indulge in the raw, sensory pleasures of the flesh. His virgin brain, overwhelmed by this intense simulation, seemed to crash for a moment. Because it truly was the first time he had seen women wearing such revealing clothes, and more so these world-ending level-hot MILFs. They had his primal, untamed charm to them, that modern women couldn't even dream to compare. He blinked. Once and then twice, but they were still there, still feeling unreal. Okay, he muttered under his breath. So the afterlife apparently comes with tribal supermodels. Good to know. Without giving him time to think further, both these women hurried inside with worried expressions etched on their faces. The white-haired one moved first. Up close, she looked even enchanting, calm but sharp-eyed at the same time. Her every motion seems to be deliberate. If the tanned woman radiated energy like fire, this one was cold water. Steady, focused, precise. He tried to pretend he didn't see them, forcing his eyes half shut and breathing deep and heavy. But honestly, it wasn't much of an act. The pain was still hammering his brain, something which he had been trying to suppress since earlier, clawing on his head like something was trying to drill its way in. Every breath came ragged, chest trembling and body drenched in sweat. The white-haired woman knelt beside him, examining him like he was an injured animal that might drop dead any second. She muttered something to the other woman, in rough, rhythmic sounds that didn't sound like any language he'd ever heard. Then she reached into a pouch hanging from her hip and took something out. Leaves, herbs, and maybe crushed roots smeared together into a paste. No matter how you look at it, the stuff looked questionable. A weird greenish-brown mix, like someone had blended moss with despair. Oh, great, he thought weakly. Prehistoric medicine. This'll end well. Before he could say or do anything, the woman scooped a bit of the mixture with her fingers and leaned closer. Her other hand slid under his jaw, tilting his head slightly upward. And then, she just fed it to him. He wanted to struggle. There is no way in hell he would be alright swallowing this weird mixture. But alas, even if he tried he couldn't move. His body was still heavy, unresponsive, every limb disconnected from command. All he could do was lie there and helplessly exist, while the mystery paste went down his throat. He despaired mentally and was ready for some weird, bitter taste. But, even after waiting for a while, no such taste was registered by his brain. And surprisingly, it didn't taste terrible. Instead, it was sharp, earthy, a bit minty, like crushed herbs with a hint of smoke and metal, and there was a faint sweetness under it, something floral, maybe berries or tree sap. There was even a cooling tingle that spread down his throat, settling in his chest. Weird, but not disgusting, and weirdly refreshing for something that looked like swamp mud. Under the watchful and worried eyes of the two women, something really strange began to happen. The tearing headache that had been clawing through his skull since he had woken up finally started to fade. The pounding behind his eyes softened, then dulled, then vanished entirely. His scrunched-up face slowly relaxed on its own. His breathing evened out, and for the first time since waking, his body didn't feel like it was on fire, and warmth began to ripple through his whole body. Slow, steady, and nourishing. It started in his chest and spread outward, filling every limb with a strange calm energy. His muscles stopped twitching, his fingers loosened. The feeling was almost blissful, like a man dying of thirst suddenly was handed a bucket of cold water in the middle of a desert. He didn't know what the hell that green stuff was, but it worked, miraculously so. The two women exchanged glances. The tanned one smiled faintly, relief flickering in her dark eyes. The white-haired one let out a small sigh, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Then they began to talk. Their voices were low and melodic, words rough and unfamiliar, full of clicks and rolling tones. Soul couldn't understand a thing. But the rhythm of it, the way the silver-haired one spoke and the other nodded, told him everything. It seemed like the pale one was giving the tanned one some instructions. He tried to listen, tried to stay awake and observe what was happening. But his eyelids had grown impossibly heavy. The warmth inside him was turning into drowsiness, a heavy wave dragging him under. The edges of the world began to blur, melting into soft colors and echoing sounds. The last thing he saw before his vision faded again was the silver-haired woman looking down at him, murmuring something he didn't understand, her voice calm, like a lullaby echoing through his mind. Then everything went dark again. After losing consciousness, he didn't exactly have a good night's sleep. Heck, it didn't even feel like a normal rest. It was more like getting hit by a file transfer or maybe a system update. You know, the kind that starts without asking, freezes your screen, and makes you question whether your PC's ever going to turn back on. Except this wasn't a computer. This was his brain. And whatever the heck was happening inside it felt wrong. You see, normally, the human brain performs its own quiet maintenance every night, slowly rewiring itself, organizing memories, defragmenting thoughts, all calm and polite about it. But in this case, it was like someone crammed years' worth of data into a single brutal download. Data flooded in. Images, sounds, smells, everything all at once. Foreign memories continued pouring into his skull like someone trying to install a new operating system on an already run-down hardware. Somewhere in that deep, foggy half-dream, reality started rewriting itself. Various fragments of memory scrolled behind his eyelids, rearranging thoughts that weren't his, mixing and merging like corrupted files trying to rebuild. A constant dull buzz seemed to fill his head. Then, flashes of color, like in those psycho movies, sounds, voices he didn't recognize, began to cram into his head. At this point, his mind wasn't even dreaming anymore. It was more like processing and downloading. He tried to think, to speak, to pull himself awake, but his consciousness was locked in. It felt like being trapped in a server reboot, aware of everything, but unable to do or stop anything. Slowly, the buzzing grew sharper and sharper. For a moment he thought he was going to go insane, layers of whispering, talking, singing, screaming overlapped like dozens, hundreds of people were talking out of sync, all at once. Slowly, he seemed to be able to understand something but at the same nothing, then almost make out words, names, emotions, in short everything. Then all at once, a surge of information slammed straight into his brain, and then, language pack successfully installed. Or, well, that's how his modern fried brain interpreted it. He couldn't explain how, but the gibberish those two women had been speaking earlier began to make sense in fragments. Soft vowels, sharp consonants, rhythmic and primal, like nature trying to form words. It wasn't elegant, definitely not like English, Chinese, or anything civilized. It was rough or maybe more like raw. Every sentence sounded like it had been carved by nature itself, and every sound shaped by the need for survival. He drifted in that space, caught between two languages, the one he had known before and one that seemed unfamiliar but still his own. The one from a civilization that built skyscrapers and dopamine addictions, and the other from a world that didn't even know what a wheel was. And with the words came memories. Memories, of course not his own. They came rushing in blurred, half-broken, and slid strangely into place like puzzle pieces. Faces, names, places, everything his previous self had ever experienced. And that's when he realized who those two women were. That black-haired hot MILF? Her name was Lyra. His aunt. Yeah, real aunt, apparently. Fierce, warm, and terrifying in the same breath. And of course, drop-dead gorgeous. She was the type who could club a bear to death and still scold you for not eating enough. At least that's the impression she had on his previous self. And the white-haired bombshell? She was Ira, the tribe's only healer, respected and feared by everyone. She was the kind of woman who could mix random roots and leaves and somehow make death lose its schedule. Cold to the eyes, calm in her tone, steady in her movements. She had the kind of presence that could slow down panic just by simply existing. And finally, him, the body he was in, that was a whole other issue. He definitely wasn't himself anymore. Not the Gooning legend of the modern world. Not the degenerate scholar of smutty fiction. This body belonged to someone else. A young tribesman named Soul of the Osari tribe, one of the many nomadic tribe, roaming the southernmost end of this world. A vast land known as Aswaria. From what little the memories offered, the Osari weren't much different from countless other tribes. They moved with the seasons, hunting, gathering, surviving, following prey, chasing warmth, living off the land like wild animals drifting through the wilderness. And of course, with no civilization and no cities or anything like that. It was just people and nature in an endless tug of war. They had no tools beyond stone and bone or some household stuff made by weaving and pottery. And Aswaria itself? That was another beast entirely. Even in fragmented recollections, its scale was staggering, not like his primitive brain understood stuff like that. He remembered hearing from mouth of some elders about it. A world so massive that it had no end. Mountains that pierced clouds, forests stretching farther than sight. Beasts so large that stories about them sounded like made-up bullshit, but they were in fact real. No one knew this world's true size, at least their tribe hadn't. It was truly a world without borders, without maps, and without mercy. And then came the darker fragments. Soul's eyes twitched in his sleep, but the memories kept flooding in without any reason or regard. And he finally got the answer how his previous self had died. The body's previous owner, the original Soul, had died in the, well, wild. Not like he could die in a 5-star hotel. Ahem. Back to topic, it was a rite of passage that had gone wrong. It was supposed to be his first solo hunt, the kind every young man in the tribe had to complete to earn his right to go out of the tribe and hunt. But unfortunately, or fortunately for us, something had gone wrong. He didn't know what that wrong was, as he didn't find any memories related to that. He'd been found the next day, half dead, and finally brought back by hunters who thought he wouldn't last the night. Well, he technically did last, but at what cost? Honestly, it had been pure luck that they found him in one piece at all. Or maybe fate. Who knows? And judging by the memories, that wasn't even the first tragedy. Stuff like this was extremely common here in Osweria. Life here was as worthless as a piece of paper used and thrown away. And from deeper memories, he had found even more unsettling fragments. Just a year ago, the Osari tribe had been nearly wiped out. There was a sudden raid by the Vorik tribe, a stronger, crueler people from the further north. Like them, they were also a nomadic tribe, and when passing through this place, they found their tribe and began to eye their hunting ground, which had an abundance of wild animals. The Vorik tribesmen were the raiding party, bigger in number, faster in killing. And they also came at night without any warning, like shadows, fast, merciless, armed with stone axes and spears, which obviously caught them by surprise, and soon many of the tribesmen trying to resist the invaders were ruthlessly slaughtered, including his own parents. Well, more specifically, his father died while protecting the tribe and his mother died while protecting him. The only reason he could survive by now was because Aunt Lyra rescued him without caring about her own life. The memories of that day echoed in his mind. The air had been filled with screams, blood and fire that day. The disgusting smell of blood, broken parts of bodies, falling men and women running with kids, was still fresh in his memory. And just when it seemed the Osari would vanish from this world, fate threw in one more absurd twist, cruelly, absurdly, beautifully. Came in the form of a monster. Not just any creature with fang and claw, but a massive prehistoric predator. The tribes called it Thornmaw, though in truth it didn't need a name. It was a nightmare that walked on 4 legs. Something huge and wide, like a prehistoric bear fused with a prehistoric lion. Spiked fur bristled across its neck, shoulders rolling under skin the color of coarse dark sand. Its head looked carved from stone, its jaws lined with bone blades meant for directly ripping the prey. It suddenly emerged from the forest without sound or any warning. But maybe because of his pride as a predator, reaching near the tribe, it didn't even bother to hide and growled loudly to announce his presence. Hearing the sudden roar, the whole battlefield went silent. One moment there was wanton screaming and fire, and the next, complete silence. Even the Vorik raiders froze mid-swing, their blood-soaked weapons hovering in disbelief. The beast roared once again, and then, without hesitation, started a bloody massacre. No one knows how and why he came here, as it wasn't his habitat. Maybe it was drawn by the scent of blood, or maybe was just crossing from here. Anyways, as he attacked, the first one to bear the burnt were those bastards from the Vorik tribe, as they were on the outermost edge of the tribe and closest to the beast, or maybe they just seemed bigger and more delicious. The memory afterwards was simply chaotic. Blood, dust, shadows, roars, broken bodies, all impacted his mind. The creature moved like a building given form, its size too massive to make sense, its speed too fast to comprehend. Its guttural growl seemed to split the air itself and immediately rendered any thoughts of resistance worthless. The first man didn't even have time to scream. One moment he was there, the next, half of him was gone, shredded into blood mist. Another was thrown aside, body snapping against the roots of a fallen tree like a child's toy. Its claws were half a foot long, partially retractable knives that ripped through bodies like wet parchment. Every strike broke bone. Every bite removed a life. Blood sprayed across the land, painting the air in a red haze. Wherever it went, only blood and broken pieces of bodies remained. But of course, Vorik tribe wasn't a paper tiger. Having survived in the wild, they also had considerable strength, so they also fought back, wild and desperate. Because wilderness had taught them, running away from such a monster was impossible. So why not give it your all for a chance of survival? They hurled spears, shouted war cries, tried to surround the monster. But in front of that massive beast, their strength was akin to a child trying to fight a lion. their strength, their discipline, their fury, all meaningless in front of something that had been born perfect for killing. The beast tore through them as if the laws of survival simply didn't apply to it. Limbs scattered, faces twisted in terror. The ground turned slick with blood. Every breath reeked of iron and smoke. But as they say, there is strength in numbers. After fighting and running around the whole night, they finally managed to injure the beast enough. It had taken spears through the shoulder, gashes down its flank, an eye clouded by blood. And yet it didn't retreat. It stared at the survivors, lips curling back to show its blade-lined muzzle, daring anyone to try again. Of course, no one did. Seeing this, he calmly sat down and without a care in the world started eating. And for a time there were only wet, steady sounds of teeth grinding through what used to be people. It munched through the broken bodies as if they were nothing more than leftovers. Flesh, bone, skin. It was all the same for him. After a while, and what felt like an eternity, it finally had its fill and lifted its head. Blood dripped down its mouth in thick, lazy strands. It gave one last glance at the tribe and proudly walked away. The Vorik tribe had technically managed to survive, if you could call that, but it also cost them a considerable number of sacrifices. Their victory was soaked in blood of their own, and their numbers didn't even amount to a quarter. As for where the Osari tribe was this whole time, of course, they ran and hid away without hesitation. This was their home ground, so obviously they had advantage in this regard. Seeing the beast retreat, they slowly got out their hiding ground. By now the strength of each tribe was almost equal, so in the end, the Vorik tribe tucked their tails and ran away, of course, not without leaving behind a few more bodies, who were hunted by the Osari tribe. So yes, the Osari tribe survived that night, although barely. But honestly, survived was a very generous word, because almost all able men died that day, leaving behind women and kids. Since then, the tribe had been fading, fewer men, fewer hunters, and fewer chances. As if the land seemed to have turned its back on them. That was also the reason the previous soul dared to venture into the wild. He wanted to prove himself as a qualified hunter and go hunting. But of course, he didn't succeed, and dropped dead due to reasons he wasn't clear about yet, as the memories of that time were still missing. So what lesson do we learn from here, kids? No matter how grim the situation is or how desperate things get, never overestimate your strength. Otherwise, your heroic ending will look exactly like his, tragic, stupid, and forgotten soon. Anyway, where were we? Ah yes. And now, for some twisted reason, the universe had decided to drop him here. A guy whose greatest accomplishment involved gooning for 11 hours straight. As he slowly regained consciousness, the first thing he noticed was the warm glow of late afternoon sunlight passing through the wall of the hut, enveloping him. He exhaled, a long, shaky breath that felt like it carried the weight of 2 lives. His head still ached faintly, not from pain this time, but from memory. A bit too much memory. He tried to move, but his body was still stiff and weak. He sighed and slowly turned his head and saw that his Aunt Lyra was sitting cross-legged near the wall, weaving a basket out of some dried vines. Her hands moved quickly, in a practiced rhythm, the kind you get from doing something thousands of times. Her face was a bit tired, but still drop-dead gorgeous. For a moment he was fascinated and just continued to stare. He didn't know if it was just his aunt. But damn, she is really gorgeous, like much more gorgeous than those so-called celebrities in his last life. So, here comes a very serious question. Why is this primitive woman so damn gorgeous? Aren't primitive women supposed to be rough and ugly? He searched his memory and found that most of the women in the tribe were above average in appearance, with many simply being bombshells. Maybe it's because he has been staring a bit too intently. She suddenly turned her head and met his eyes, and for a moment his heartbeat sped up, and his throat felt a bit dry. Damn, how can a woman be so beautiful? Seeing him, she gasped softly and immediately jolted up with a pleasantly surprised expression and hurried towards him. The basket in her hand was immediately forgotten and fell down, and in a moment she was already kneeling beside him, with an expression mixed with worry and concern etched on her face. "Soul," she whispered, voice soft but trembling. "You're awake." He blinked up at her, trying to speak, but his throat felt like literal sandpaper and he couldn't help cough. Seeing this, her eyes widened a bit, and she hurriedly stood up and reached out for the clay jar resting in a cool, shaded corner. Taking a clay cup from the side, she filled the cup with water and hurried back to his side and slid an arm behind him to lift him gently. Seeing this, Soul was so touched that he felt that his eyes would start watering. Damn! When was the last time someone cared about him like this? But he still managed to control himself and took small, desperate gulps at first, because he was really damn thirsty. Then took big gulps. The water slid smoothly down his throat, moisturizing the dry throat. The water was cool, earthy, and a bit sweet. Much better than any expensive mineral water he ever had. She stayed still and let him drink, her breath even and face concerned. The scent of clay in her body assaulted his nose as he loosened the cup. She immediately filled another cup and helped him drink. This time he drank normally. "Are you okay now?" she asked. He nodded, still catching his breath. She eased up back down, wiped the rim with her palm and returned the cup to the pot, the whole motion extremely careful. Seeing her back, "Aunt, I'm okay," he said, voice rough, the words sounding strange in his own mouth. The sound of it was definitely his voice but not quite his, and this made him pause for a second. Felt heavier, deeper. This voice belonged to this body, not the one he used to remember. Still, after this, the words came much easier. "I'm okay," he repeated, a little steadier this time. Lyra's shoulders finally dropped, the tension easing out of her face. She let out a breath that sounded like it had been stuck in her chest for days, then gave him a weak smile. He tried to move again and successfully managed to lift his arm, and maybe shift the leg a bit, but that was it. His muscles still screamed in protest, but this time the peaceful one, not the violent one. His body felt used, drained, like it had been running for days while he slept. He couldn't help wondering what the heck his previous self did to make the body so wrecked. Lyra leaned closer, brushing the back of her hand against his forehead like she was checking for fever. Her skin was cool, steady, and for a second the simple human warmth of it felt more than he expected. It had been a long time since he had been in such close contact with a human, let alone a woman. Up close, he felt even more of her beauty. She really was beautiful in a way he hadn't noticed before. Strong, sexy body, dark eyes that could capture heart in an instant. Completely unlike the modern fragile beauties, she was the kind of beauty that belonged to someone who worked and survived in a wilderness. But damn, her seemingly gentle touch sent a shiver down his spine as she brushed the back of her hand against his fevered brow. Her skin was a soothing balm against his flushed cheeks, a stark contrast to the heat that continued to smolder within him. And as she leaned even closer, he couldn't help inhaling deeply, and the heady musk of her scent enveloped him. It was primal, wild, and utterly intoxicating. His tongue darted out to dampen his suddenly parched lips as he drank in the sight of her. The sun-kissed glow on her strong, supple skin, the dark eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom, the full, inviting lips that curved into a smile that made his heart stutter. As Lyra's hand drifted from his forehead down to his shoulder, her ample bosom brushed against his arm, sending sparks of arousal through him. He'd never been this close to women, let alone such a stunning woman, and her raw beauty radiated from every sun-kissed pore, and his gaze drifted involuntarily to her full, rounded breasts straining against the animal hide of her garment, and he didn't know why. His cock began to stir, swelling with a primal need he'd never experienced before. The intoxicating scent of her mature allure hit him like a punch to the gut, making his head spin harder than any fever could. He tried to keep his body under control, but it seemed to have a mind of its own, reacting viscerally to her proximity and charm. The feel of her cool skin against his burning flesh was electrifying, and he had to bite back a groan. Her dark eyes, capable of capturing hearts with a single glance, met his, and for a moment, they just stared at each other, each with their own thoughts, his definitely degenerate ones, while she looked at him worry. He knew he was staring like a fool, but he couldn't look away from her. The allure of the strong, capable woman, one who had clearly faced and overcome countless challenges, was almost overwhelming. Her touch, her scent, her very presence ignited a deep, primal hunger within him, stoking the flames of desire he'd never known he possessed. and when she advertently pressed her soft body against his, her breasts flattened slightly against his arm. He felt his control almost snap. A low, desperate growl rose in his throat, barely suppressed. The heat building between them threatened to consume him. Her breasts, full and high, seemed to beckon him closer. His hands twitched, yearning to explore the supple warmth of her body, to map the contours of her curves, to feel the soft give of her breasts beneath his palms. He ached to bury his face in her hair, to inhale the essence of her, to let her scent seep into his very being. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to reach out, to touch, to claim. The primal urge to claim her, to mark her as his own, surged through his bloodstream, his shaft swelling further in response. He fought to keep his breathing steady, but her intoxicating scent, a heady mix of wild herbs and feminine musk, overwhelmed his senses. His head spun, vision blurring, as he struggled to maintain control. She didn't seem to notice anything and said, "You still feel warm," she murmured, pressing lightly against his shoulder. "It's nothing," he rasped. "Just dizzy." She frowned but didn't argue. "You really scared everyone. You were cold as stone when we found you. Ira said you'd be lucky to wake up at all. Guess luck still likes me," he said. His voice cracked halfway through, as he tried to control his raging cock. She smiled a little at this. Her smile was gentle, filled with warmth, and this immediately broke any resistance he managed to gather. "Rest?" she said finally, adjusting the fur over him. "Ira said you still need to rest." He nodded, and even this nod of acknowledgement felt strained. He closed his eyes, pretending to drift off to sleep, but the desire that pulsed through his veins was far from sated. Lyra's warmth lingered, an unbearable temptation that threatened to overwhelm his senses at any given moment. The fever was real, but so was the yearning that now consumed him. A hunger he knew he shouldn't indulge, but couldn't resist. His body ached for hers, craving the touch, the taste, the belonging that only she could provide. He told himself that this was Lyra, his aunt, his savior, and yet his body, freed from its previous societal constraints, now saw her as nothing more than a primal, carnal urge, a creature to be conquered and possessed. His rigid loincloth strained against his throbbing erection, as his body trembled with a primal, instinctual desire as it urged him to succumb to the overwhelming urge coursing through his veins. His gaze locked onto the lush, full breasts mere inches from his quivering fingertips, and a groan of longing escaped his lips. The need to touch, to claim, to make her his was all-consuming. The battle raging within him was a treacherous tightrope, for in the depths of that primitive, feral desire, Soul knew that giving in could mean the end of whatever fragile bond they shared. And yet, the promise of that explosive, untamed passion was almost too tempting to resist. In the end, he finally gave in and decided to test the limits. He suddenly scrunched up his face and made an extremely pained expression. Seeing this, she hastened to his side with a concerned face. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice laced with worry, her large breast heaving with each anxious breath. Biting back a groan, he pretended to swallow hard and managed to rasp out, "Yes, I don't why it suddenly hurts. Very much." "Where? Hurry up and tell me," she cooed, her husky voice sending tingles down Soul's spine. He winced, the very thought of voicing his need out loud making him tremble. For a moment he wanted to back out, but Lyra's sun-kissed skin and her lush curves beckoned him like a siren's call. Summoning every ounce of courage, he forced out the words, "Down there. It is hurting very much. Can you please help me?" With a pleading expression. His gaze dropped involuntarily to the generous swell of her breasts, the rosy peaks straining against the animal skin fabric. She followed his gaze, her eyes widening as they settled on the impressive, throbbing erection straining against the confines of his loincloth. Seeing this, his breath also hitched. As he waited for her response, the pulsing heat of his arousal undeniable even through the fabric. I'll go fetch Ira," she stammered, turning to leave. But Soul's plea halted her in her tracks, his voice cracking with desperation. "No need, it'll be okay without her help." Lyra frowned, already halfway to standing. You're in pain, Soul? He gulped, forcing a strained smile, trying to sound calm. I just remembered something. Lady Ira once taught me a method to ease pain like this. I can try that. Hearing this, she finally stopped mid-step. She turned back, eyes narrowing with concern and a trace of disbelief. Ira taught you? She asked. He nodded slightly, keeping his expression serious, almost pleading. Yes, she did. For a moment, Lyra just stared at him. Then she sighed softly, shoulders dropping. Maybe it was the way he said it, maybe it was the innocent pained look on his face. Either way, she believed him. He'd always been close with the tribespeople, especially Ira. Always curious. Always the kind to listen. Maybe she had really taught him. And it wasn't right to keep disturbing her again and again. So she hesitated, then nodded, stepping back toward him and sitting down again. All right, she said finally. Tell me, Soul, how can I help you? Her husky voice sending tingles down his spine. Soul's gaze locked onto hers, his voice a bit ashamed and hesitant as he finally spoke. Why, you need to remove the loincloth from my legs, and massage that part with your hand. Your manhood? She whispered, a bit stunned by his request. Soul's groin throbbed in time with his racing heart, his cock straining further against the confines of his loincloth. Why yes, Aunt, he said as he pleaded. Please help me, it hurts. But she still hesitated, and continued to stare at his raging cock. Her hesitation was explainable, and Soul could hardly blame her. In this primitive culture, private body parts were considered sacred and reserved solely for the union of spouses. But she finally stepped back to him and kneeled down next to him, her fingers hovering uncertainly near the ties of his loincloth. His breath caught in his throat as he watched her, his cock throbbing in anticipation. Finally, she nodded and reached for the loincloth, her fingers deftly untying the knot. As the garment fell away, his rigid cock sprang free, standing at full attention. For a moment, she stared in stunned silence, the magnitude of his size and arousal rendering her speechless. Honestly, even Soul was shocked by the size. He hadn't expected this seemingly frail, by primitive world standards, body to hide such a beast. Because it was too damn big, not outrageously big, but still very big. It was a respectable 7 to 8 inches, but seeing this he felt both excited and relieved. At least in this world he was above average. The air was heavy with tension as Lyra's eyes traveled the length of his rigid cock, her plush lips parting in wonder. He could practically feel her pupils dilating. Her womanly senses seemed to be awakened by the sight of his arousal. His own hands twitched, yearning to reach out and claim those ripe mounds, to bury his face in the sweet valley between them. As she tentatively reached out to touch him, his breath quickened, and a low moan escaped his lips as her hand finally made contact with his sensitive flesh. Her movements were clumsy at first, clearly showcasing her inexperience. Yes, Jay, just like that, he encouraged, his body arching into her touch as waves of pleasure crashed over him. Hearing this, she caressed his cock slowly. Her caress, a mix of softness and roughness, seemed to melt his cock, releasing pleasured gasps from his lips. As his gaze drifted to her bust again, now more prominent in her kneeling position, his hands yearning to reach out and caress, pinch, suckle the tempting mounds. His mind reeled, consumed by the primal urge to claim Lyra's body as his own. He could almost taste her sweetness, feel the velvety softness of her inner thighs as he parted them with his hands. The very thought of sinking into her warmth, of hearing her cries of passion echoing through the house, made his cock pulse even more fervently. But alas, his body was too weak and unresponsive, except his raging cock, leaving him utterly at her mercy. So, he focused his attention back on the sensual assault on his cock, a string of pre-cum beating at the tip. She diligently continued stroking with extreme care and his cock swelled further, earning a questioning glance from her. She looked up at him uncertainly, her fingers trembling slightly on his length, before he clarified. This is completely normal, please go on. He breathed, his voice low and husky, his cock throbbing with need at the innocent, wanton touch. She nodded and focused back on giving him a handjob. Not that she knew. Suddenly, her grip was a bit too firm, and he couldn't help wince, his breath catching in his throat. Lighter? Aunt? A bit lighter, she hurriedly obliged and let go, and he offered guidance, teaching her to stroke with a gentler touch. I'm sorry my hands are a bit too rough. Is this right now? She asked, her brow furrowed in concentration. This should have been done by Ira, as her hands are as soft as a summer breeze. Hearing this, he imagined Ira stroking his cock. The thought of those healer hands on his cock, stroking him with gentle precision, sent a bolt of lust through him, and for a moment, he imagined fucking Ira, the healer, hard and deep, until she screamed his name. Just imagining that made him swallow hard. But as his gaze fell on the woman before him, he felt even great sense of enjoyment. Who would have thought there would come a day when such a beautiful woman would be stroking his cock, and more so with such a gentle and caring expression. Anyway, there will definitely be a chance to enjoy Ira too. But let's first enjoy my dear aunt. His mind reeling with the possibilities. He ached to bury his cock within her warm pussy, to feel her tight, wet heat engulfing him. But he knew such intimacy was forbidden, at least for now. Instead, he decided to up the game a bit and suggested, "It would take too long like this. Aunt, please use your saliva. Spit on it and then stroke again." The woman looked taken aback by his request, as she turned to look at him with a confused expression. Seeing his innocent expression, she gave in as her curiosity and desire to help won out. She leaned forward, her warm breath caressing his cock as she wet her lips with her tongue. With a tentative flick, she spat onto his shaft, the slick string glistening in the fading light. He watched, transfixed, as her mouth followed the path of her spit, her tongue darting out to catch the droplets, and his mind raced with forbidden fantasies of bringing her to her knees, as he buried his cock deep into her throat until she gagged, her nose pressed against his pelvis. But alas, it was still too early, as he was still unfamiliar with this world, and he didn't want to ruin the grand scheme thanks to his impulsive behavior. Anyways, the combination of her slick saliva and firm strokes was really exquisite, sending shivers of pleasure rippling through his body. He felt lightheaded, his senses heightened to the point of overload. Her fingers were still clumsy, but the saliva acted as a perfect lubricant, allowing her to glide up and down his length with ease. As for why he could do such an immoral and degenerate act so easily, it was because from his memories he found quite a number of shocking discoveries, one of the most shocking being that the boundaries of morality and shame surrounding sexual intimacy were non-existent in this world. The inhabitants, going about their daily lives, could engage in the most explicit acts without a second thought, not even caring about the presence of family or anyone else. For them, sex was a sacred ritual, a primal act of union solely aimed at conceiving the next generation. The act itself, devoid of romanticism or sensual delight, was seen as a mere biological necessity. The idea of enjoying or relishing in such an act was perplexing, even unfathomable. This unique dynamic allowed for a level of sexual liberation that would be unimaginable in his own world, rendering the lines between morality and degeneracy blurred and irrelevant. That's the reason he took the risk. As for the limits, he had to test them himself because when it came to stuff like this, his previous self was a blank slate. As she continued to work her deft fingers along his rigid length, she became more and more confident, and seeing him enjoy as she stroked harder, her touch became more fevered, her grip tighter. She was like an artist, a maestro of carnal delight, and he was her willing canvas. Each stroke, each twist, sent shockwaves of pleasure coursing through him, elevating him to dizzying heights of ecstasy. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body taut as a bowstring, poised to snap at any moment. He tried hard to control, to enjoy this moment longer, but alas, with a shuddering cry, he finally erupted, his hot, thick seed spilling forth in torrents, painting her face and boobs with its sticky essence. She froze, a look of incredulity washing over her features as she stared at the weird, slimy liquid dripping from her chin. What is this?" she stammered, her voice trembling with shock. Even though he was on cloud 9, he still felt a burst of euphoria at her reaction. his climax intensifying further at the innocent and confused look on her face. Realizing further that she likely had no concept of this primal and fundamental aspect of male biology. And from his memories he found that semen was believed to be just another form of urine. But he knew the truth. This copious release was the very essence of his pleasure, a physical manifestation of his most intimate desires. Still, he tried to explain the concept to her to make future action easier. Anyway, there is no such thing as sexual shame in this world. It's what happens when a man's body feels really, really good. A release of pent-up tension that brings both relief and joy. He managed to gasp out, his mind reeling from the sheer magnitude of his release. She listened intently, a look of reverence on her face, as if he had shared some profound truth. She nodded, still visibly perplexed but not judging. "I see," she said, wiping a trail of his cum from her face with a thumb. "Are you okay now?" He nodded vigorously, a bright, dazed grin spreading across his face. "Thank you, Aunt. It doesn't hurt anymore." Hearing this, her smile broadened, a note of pride appearing in her voice as she said, "If you ever feel that way again, just let me know. Okay? I'll help you." The way she said it, with a hint of pride and a generous smile, made his spent cock twitch with renewed interest. As he looked at her, cum-speckled face aglow with a sense of accomplishment, an overwhelming sense of satisfaction washed over him. In this moment, with her offering him such tender care, he knew he'd do anything to please her, to bring that radiant smile to her lips again and again, though the one he would love would definitely be this cum-filled smile. And the forbidden nature of their relationship only added to the intensity of pleasure. He couldn't wait to explore many more wonders and secrets the human body held, with her by his side. As he settled back into his bed of furs, a peculiar sensation crept through his stiff limbs. It was subtle at first, but gradually intensified. To his astonishment, the heavy lethargy that had gripped him since he was transmigrated began to melt away, replaced by a tingling sensation coursing through his limbs, allowing him to move around a bit, but he still decided to continue pretending for a bit longer, and in this way he could using the excuse of pain to go even further. But still, to encourage her, he showed a bit of movement. Suddenly witnessing this remarkable change, his aunt gazed at him with a mix of incredulity and awe and felt an even deeper conviction that the unusual technique she had employed, her skilled hand massage, was indeed the catalyst for this extraordinary phenomenon. Looking at the expression on her face, he knew that he had succeeded, but still leaving that aside he was equally astonished and glad by the discovery of these weird effects, his mind racing with various reasons and implications. After contemplating for a while, he came to the conclusion that the only reason for this could only be the release just now. Even though he felt a bit incredulous, he still couldn't help believing. Damn, even something absurd like transmigration is possible, so why couldn't something like this be possible? And maybe it is his standard cheat he got due to transmigration. The more he thought, the more it made sense. This discovery could significantly expedite his recovery, potentially allowing him to return to his wandering ways sooner rather than later. And to think, he now had not one, but a myriad of beautiful women from the tribe eager to be claimed as his own. The very thought sent a shiver of anticipation through his revitalized body. And if he could really get stronger this way, then this primitive wouldn't be such a bad place for transmigration anymore. Maybe it would be a blessing. Once again, looking at Lyra, despite the overwhelming urge to throw caution to the wind and ravish her right then and there, Sol knew he had to proceed with restraint. In this world, sex was a sacred act, not to be taken too lightly. He would have to pace himself, building up to more carnal exploits with his aunt. But the realization that his aunt, normally a prim and proper figure, was now his personal sexual guide still filled him with an intense sense of excitement and arousal. As he lay there, envisioning the pleasures that awaited him with the other women, he knew that his days of being a virgin were gone, and a new era of dominance and debauchery awaited him among the tribespeople. Unaware of his dark thoughts, Lyra looked at his blissful relaxed body, and frowned, noticing his sweaty and sticky body. Even from a distance, she could smell the stale, sticky scent. Her brows pulled together, as the concept of hygiene wasn't a habit here. It was akin to a law, a survival instinct wired into their bones. Soul noticed the frown and winced internally. "Oh, I'm in trouble," he muttered under his breath. She didn't scold him or anything because it was really not his fault, as he had been unconscious since the last few days. Without a word, she slid an arm under his shoulder with practiced gentleness and helped him sit up. She moved to help him, but suddenly stopped, her breath catching in her throat. Her gaze was fixed on the bedding beneath him. The thick cured hide, skin that usually turned away stone blades, was shredded. It was torn clean through, as if a massive beast had clawed at it in a frenzy. But it was what lay beneath that made her pale. A few deep, cracked furrows were gouged into the hard-packed earth floor. The dirt cracked and blackened as if struck by lightning. She traced the marks with a trembling finger, then looked at Soul's hand. It was caked in the same earth. She whispered internally, looking at him. He did this. She swallowed hard, masking her shock, but her hands shook slightly as she reached for him. "Come on, my dear," she said, voice low and gentle. "Let me help you wash up. You'll catch sickness if you stay like this." "Wash me?" he repeated, blinking. "Now." "Yes, now." The tone left no room for argument. "Can I at least?" "No." She was already lifting him. He groaned. "But I am barely conscious." It was not that he was averse to bathing, but he knew that in this situation the only way he could bathe without blowing his cover up was if she helped him, and looking at her posture, it was clear that she was thinking the same too. Damn, it would be really embarrassing. But she ignored his plea and replied, "You can talk. That means you can take a bath. And don't worry, I'll help you." Before he could argue, or get out of his sage mode, she carefully pulled him to his feet, steady but firm, and guided him outside the hut. The hut's reed door creaked aside, as he was pulled out, and couldn't help squinting at the sky. The sun was already sliding down, fat and orange, throwing long streaks of light across the sky. Clouds hung loose and ragged, their edges glowing like someone set them on fire. Even the air felt fresh and clean in his chest, as he took a deep breath, so refreshing that he breathed deeper, completely unlike the heavy, smoke-choked breath of modern cities. It was just the scent of ground, grass, and the faint curl of cooking fires drifting on the wind. "Wow," he whispered. "This is actually nice." By now evening was close, but it still felt clear, almost new, as if the whole world was rinsed clear. She led him towards the backyard. Behind the hut, there was a small washing area fenced by woven reeds. A few clay jars lined the edge, filled with clear water from the nearby stream. The floor was made of stone, smoothened by years of use. Soul blinked. "This is actually way cleaner than my apartment back home." "You're what?" "Nothing. Primitive, sure. But neat, organized, and functional. And that's the thing most people always get wrong. Most people imagine tribal life as filthy, savage, crawling with stink and grime. But that's because they don't know shit about how people actually lived. The truth? These people were human too. They had noses. They had eyes. They knew what filth was. They knew when something smelled wrong, looked wrong, felt wrong. They understood filth and disease in the way instinct understands fire. Not as science, but as survival. They knew that if you didn't clean yourself, things rotted: wounds, food, even people. And also knew that filth meant sickness, and sickness obviously meant death in this world. That's why washing wasn't just hygiene here. It was akin to a ritual. In fact, they were even more hygienic than many people, especially of our otaku buddies back home, who would go weeks without touching the water and left sacred ritual of bathing for only special occasions. He would definitely not admit that he was also part of that circle. Never. Anyways, here, in their culture, to be clean was to be protected. Dirt wasn't just dirt. It was seen as the home of sickness, evil, and dark energy. A way to scrub away not only dirt, but whatever darkness clung to the soul. Evil, bad omens, the weight of death. All of it was believed to stick to the body like invisible mud. That's why before any important event, like hunt, birth, meal, or sacred gatherings, they wash from head to toe and become squeaking clean. They called it cleansing the spirits and getting nature's blessings. The place he was right now was called Southern Wilderness, and despite being called the southern wilderness. The land wasn't barren at all. It was lush, with rivers crisscrossed like veins under the skin of the world. Big ones, small ones, clear ones, and muddy ones all were available. You just have to be really brave to venture into them, especially the muddy ones. Wherever you looked, water shimmered somewhere nearby. And people used it constantly too. They bathed in rivers, washed their tools, their food, their kids, and probably their sins too. Men would scrub themselves raw before hunts. They used river water, ash, sand, leaves, whatever nature gave, to clean themselves and get spirit's blessing and to remove scent and sweat so prey couldn't smell them. And after every hunt, they rubbed their skin with rough bark or sand to remove blood and sweat. Women, always being extra, didn't just contend with water. They mixed scented oils from tree resin, crushed petals, and grinded herbs to keep their skin soft, refreshed, and ward off insects. Heck, they even used charcoal paste for their teeth. Black, gritty, but effective. Primitive, yes. Stupid? Not even close. Clean meant safe. Clean meant alive. In a world this wild, that was common sense. In fact, they seemed borderline obsessed with cleanliness. Even their rituals reflected it. They believed clean bodies kept the tribe's spirit strong and untainted. For a so-called primitive world, they sure looked like they had their shit together. Anyways, back to topic. Lyra helped him sit on a raised stone slab. He hissed due to sudden coldness on his butt cheeks. She skillfully filled the clay basin and poured a jug of water over his head without warning. It was cool, shocking, and exactly what he needed. The water ran down his neck and back, carrying away dirt, dried sweat, and the faint smell of herbs. Lyra, a warning would have been nice. Hold still, she said, taking a cloth and wiping his arms and chest with firm, practiced motions. You reek. Thanks for the compliment, he muttered. She didn't smile and continued. You mustn't let the pain freeze your body, she murmured. Still water turns foul. Still flesh turns weak. What he could do, he could only nod obediently, otherwise, he knew that a lecture was on his way. She continued working in silence for a moment, water dripping rhythmically against the stone floor. Sol watched her expression soften into something calmer, almost ritualistic. He swallowed. Aunt Lyra? Thank you. Really. Her hand paused on his arm. Your family, Sol. He didn't know what to say to that, so he looked away. After washing the upper side, finally it was the time for his groins and the one he was most curious about, as to what she would do, because until now his previous self had always bathed alone, or with his mother. It was first time being bathed by his aunt. She soon finished cleaning his upper body and rinsed the cloth again. All right, now for the rest. Sol blinked, even though he knew what she was referring to, but he still pretended otherwise and wanted to test the limits. The rest as in? The rest, she repeated calmly. He stared at her. She stared back. Lyra, he said slowly, I am a grown man. Yes, so I can handle the rest myself. She raised an eyebrow. You could barely stand. Okay, valid point, but listen. In this tribe, she said, voice steady, the caretaker washes the weak. There is no shame. I am full of shame. Not enough to survive, she replied. He opened his mouth to argue, as if he was really against it. Seeing her expression, he obediently shut it, fearing that she would really take his act seriously. She washed his entire body with care, paying little mind to his exposed genitals. Her gentle hands glided over his skin, soothing his weary frame. As she finished washing his body, finally it was time for his genitals, or more specifically his cock. Slowly and sensually, she began washing his cock. As her gentle hands wrapped around his spent member, he let out a contented sigh, the warm water and her tender touch coaxing a final drop of cum from his overstimulated cock. She lavished attention on every inch, her delicate fingers gliding with practiced ease along the sensitive underside, the thick shaft, and the delicate crown. It was an intimate, sensual experience, almost a mini handjob. It was as if this gentle massage was prolonging the pleasure, building the tension without the need for a climax. Despite the erotic undertones, her actions remained pure and selfless, focused solely on his comfort and well-being. Even though he was mentally ready for another round, but alas, his exhausted body, still reeling from recent escapades, lacked the strength for another sexual encounter. Despite the disappointment, he savored the gentle caress, grateful for her attentiveness and the unspoken promise of future pleasures once his strength returned. In that moment, the simple act of washing felt like a sensual dance, a tender demonstration of affection that nourished both his body and soul. With a satisfied smile, she tenderly rinsed him clean, her touch a soothing balm to the aching muscles and ragged breath of his. When she felt that he was finally clean, or at least less of a walking biohazard, Lyra gave a short, satisfied nod of approval, the kind that seemed to say, "All right, now you look human again." Or maybe it was just his imagination. Without saying much, she reached to the side and picked up a small wooden flask resting on a flat stone. The container looked worn but polished from years of use, its cap sealed with a twist of fiber cord. She uncorked it with a quiet pop. Immediately, a rich, earthy smell drifted out. Soft, natural, almost comforting. He leaned forward slightly, peering inside. The liquid inside was thick, golden brown, and slow-moving, clinging to the sides as it caught the light. His nose twitched. "What is that?" he asked, curious. Seeing him look curiously, she gave him a sideways glance and snorted. "Oil," she said simply. "It keeps the skin strong. I doubt you would ever have used it yourself." He smiled awkwardly, because she was right. From the memories he had found that his previous self wasn't much keen on using oil, saying, "Men don't need fancy oils. And that's for the women." A classic case of ignorance wrapped in pride. Lyra poured a little of the oil into her palms, then rubbed her hands together slowly. The liquid spread into a sheen across her fingers, catching the afternoon light. It was thick but smooth, leaving behind a faint scent of herbs, resin, and wood smoke. "This keeps the wind from cracking the skin," she said, her tone softer now. "And it wards off insects." As she spoke, her voice lowered a little. That calm, motherly cadence she slipped into when she wasn't commanding the world. "Ira makes this from root and sap. She says it keeps the body's warmth inside." She held her hands out. "Here." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Her palms pressed gently against his shoulders as she spread the oil across his skin, warm, steady, and methodical. It wasn't much sensual like most of the study material videos he used to watch. It was care, pure and practiced. The scent filled the air, mixing with the faint breeze and the sound of trickling water. For a moment, everything around him blurred. The pain, the exhaustion, the memories. All that remained was her touch, the rhythm of her hands, and the feeling of being tended to. Lyra didn't speak again until she was done. Then, wiping her palms on a small cloth, she glanced at him. Her eyes softened, the hard edges of her expression melting away. "There," she said quietly. "That's better." He looked at her bright, satisfied smile, and involuntarily said, "Yeah, it definitely is better." Hearing this, Lyra capped the flask back, tied the cord neatly, and set it aside on the flat stone. Then she stood, dusting her palms together quick and neat, with a hint of pride that came from his praise and from helping him with the oil. He sat there for a moment, half dazed by her bright smile, his skin still tingling faintly where her hands had passed. "Stay a while, let the oil sink in," she said, her tone softer than the breeze. The warm, earthy scent of the oil lingered in the air, reminiscent of the forest after a refreshing rain. He nodded automatically, watching her graceful movements as she walked toward the door, each step deliberate and unhurried, as if she commanded even gravity to yield to her pace. When she was finally out of his sight, he exhaled and leaned over the water basin beside him. The surface was calm, reflecting the dying gold of the afternoon light. And for the first time since waking up in this strange, unfamiliar world, he really looked at his visage. Despite the subtle differences, the face staring back was unmistakably his own, same general shape. Same eyes, same nose, same dark hair, albeit thicker and cleaner than he recalled. The jawline was sharper, the eyes clearer, giving the impression of a man who truly lived a life, not just rot in a room. A crooked smile slowly spread across his lips as he traced the reflection with his eyes. Well, definitely not the lazy, sleepless wreck from the old world. He leaned closer, tracing the reflection with his eyes. His lips curled into a crooked grin. "Damn," he muttered. "Guess I really did win the genetics lottery this time. And thank God, it isn't some stranger's face. Otherwise it would have been awkward." The water rippled as he dipped his fingers in, sending his reflection scattering. When it settled again, he couldn't help noticing the subtle strength in his features. The faint scar near his temple, which he clearly remembered, came from the day he fell off his bike, as he was too stubborn to wait for training wheels. It healed quickly, but the mark stayed. Now, seeing that same scar again, he felt pretty ridiculous for a second. I mean, there is no way there could be such a coincidence in the world that he and the body he had been transmigrated had the same face, and even the same scar, right? For a brief second, he wondered if this body wasn't just coincidence, or this whole transmigration wasn't something random. Maybe this was him from some alternate version from another timeline. Same soul, different skin. A cosmic joke, maybe. He sat back, staring up at the golden sky. The lingering sunlight hit his face again, warm and soft. He exhaled a long breath, few and relaxed. Anyways, whatever the truth was, he was here now, and if there really was some conspiracy he will eventually find out, no need to fuss over something out of his control. Soon, Aunt Lyra came back holding a folded set of fresh loincloths. They were simple, rough-spun, uneven, dyed with crushed bark, but clean, tidy and smelling faintly of smoke and herbs. "Here," she said, kneeling beside him. "You still can't move much, so I'll help you." He gave a small, embarrassed nod. There wasn't much pride left in pretending he could do it himself. His body felt like it belonged to someone else. Weak, clumsy, heavy. Lyra worked quickly, her movements gentle and soft. They looked rustic, sure, but when he slipped them on, they were surprisingly soft against his skin, warm and comfortable. The fabric had been washed in river water and rubbed with oil, the fibers smoothed by use. As I have said before, primitive or not, they were still humans who had common sense, and finding comfort is in the genes of humans. When she was finished, she stepped back and gave him an approving look. "Better. You look like someone alive now." He managed a faint smile. "Yeah, better." She slipped an arm around him again and helped him stand. He leaned on her soft and mature body as she helped him inside. Feeling his arm sandwiched between two soft mounds, he couldn't help thinking, it's not too bad being like this. Together they crossed the short yard back toward the hut. The air was filled with even more scent of smoke and damp clay. Birds called somewhere in the distance. Inside, the hut was simple but alive. The main hall was wide, a space meant for both living and sleeping. Dying sunlight entered through small windows like openings in the walls, falling over woven baskets, clay pots, and neatly stacked hides. For small rooms branched off. A kitchen corner with stored roots and dried meat, one filled with pottery and tools, a sleeping room for the head of the house, and another smaller one lined with woven mats that must have belonged to children. She eased him down onto a soft pile of woven grass and fur in the main hall. It wasn't a bed by modern standards, but compared to the ground outside and the inside of his skull an hour ago, it felt like a luxury mattress. "Lie down, my dear," she said, smoothing the cloth over his legs. "Your strength will return, but not if you fight your breath." He nodded, sinking into the bedding with a long, shaky exhale. Every muscle complained, but at least they were his muscles now. At least he was alive enough to feel them. Then she turned to the low table near the wall and picked up a half-shaped lump of clay. Without ceremony, she began working, shaping wet clay with both hands moving slow, steady, sure. Press, turn, smooth. Press, turn, smooth. Soul watched her, lulled by the rhythm, until a flicker of movement in the thatch above her head caught his eye. It wasn't some spider. His new memories supplied the name instantly. It was a corpse stalker, a small, centipede-like beast with pitch-black skin, red stripes and venomous mandibles. One of the countless small beasts that tribe feared, a terrifying nightmare, as its strike was always a fatal one, without any cure. And he saw that a few months ago, someone was bitten by it and died a harrowing death, his vein turning black and screaming due to pain, that left a deep impression on his mind. They tried to kill it, but it had managed to slip away, but they didn't give up and searched for a long but didn't find it again and eventually gave up. And now to his horror, it was hanging silently from the roof, positioning itself right above Lyra's exposed neck. Lyra didn't see it. She was too focused on the clay. He wanted to shout, to lunge, not caring about pretending anymore, but he ultimately didn't, as he was afraid that if he made any movement, it would panic and attack her immediately. A great amount of panic flared in his mind. He wanted to move, but he couldn't, wanted to shout but couldn't, and his helplessness and anger instantly reached the peak. Just then, he felt a sudden eruption of heat in his chest. He didn't know what it was or what its function was, but he clung to it like a dying man grabbing a rope, and using all the might of his very being, he projected a single violent command. Die! Instantly he felt something leaving his body, and with a splat, the beast didn't just fall. Its body ruptured from the inside out, exploding into a tiny mist of black ichor, completely obliterating without a trace. Soul instantly gasped and fell back on fur bed, breathing heavily, his hand shaking violently. What was that? I did that? He was utterly confused, but remembering the earlier eruption of heat, he knew that it was definitely him, but how or what, he didn't know. Still, seeing that Lyra was safe, a massive sense of relief flooded his body, and his body slumped further. Suddenly feeling something, Lyra spun and looked around the empty room, confused. What was that? She said, turning towards him. He quickly calmed his body and nonchalantly said, What? I just seemed to feel something. She said. I didn't feel anything. Maybe it was air, he said, pretending. Hearing this, she felt that it was reasonable and nodded, turning back to work, unaware that death had hovered inches from her neck. Soul closed his eyes, feigning sleep, while wiping a trickle of blood from his nose. His heart hammered with a dark thrill. I did that, he realized, staring at his trembling hand. I didn't touch it. I just wanted it dead, and it died. He forced his mind to simulate the process again, recalling the surge of heat, the violent, focused command. He strained, trying to reproduce that eruption in his chest, seeking the power he had just glimpsed. Nothing. Only the hollow thrumming of his own adrenaline and the dull ache of his muscles remained. He tried again, projecting raw, vicious intent at a small clay shard near the wall, but it remained whole. He was just a bruised, weak man, lying on a heap of furs, helpless and shaking. The profound, terrifying power was gone as quickly as it had arrived, leaving him abandoned and confused. With a long, silent, defeated sigh, he lay back completely. He was too exhausted, too disoriented to chase the phantom power now. His body settled, heavy and unresponsive, into the soft bedding. Time seemed to slow, then flow again. The dim, dying sun continued its inevitable descent, casting shadows that stretched and danced across the room. He simply lay there, letting the minutes dissolve, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of clay meeting Lyra's palm. The focus shifted slowly from the panic and the power to the sheer, simple reality of the space around him. As she set to work at her pottery wheel, the rhythmic spinning sending her body swaying in a sensual dance, and her sweat-drenched body glistened with a primal beauty. Her long, dark hair was tied back in a haphazard braid, wisps clinging to her flushed skin. He finally felt stable enough to breathe, and he drank in the sight, his gaze roaming over her curves as if branding each contour into his memory. The soft clacking of her tools against the pottery served as a tantalizing counterpoint to the rhythmic thrum of his own heartbeat. As he watched, transfixed, a droplet of sweat trickled down her collarbone, pausing to glimmer like a precious gem before continuing its seductive path toward the valley of her breasts, barely contained by a deerskin loincloth. He imagined tracing the lines of her sweat-sheen skin with his tongue, tasting the salt and musk that clung to her. His hunger for her body rekindled by the sight of her flushed, rounded form. His arousal evident beneath the loincloth, as the tantalizing scent of her arousal wafted through the air, mingling with the earthy aroma of the hall. Every movement she made, the flex of her sculpted thighs, the bounce of her breasts as she leaned forward, seemed like a deliberate tease, a seduction designed to ignite his passion once more. His eyes roamed her sweat-slick skin, imagining the feel of her slick heat enveloping him as he watched her shape the clay into erotic forms that mirrored their own carnal desires. Soul's eyes never left her straining body as he watched, enraptured by the seemingly erotic display. Finally, he closed his eyes, savoring the lingering scent of her, a heady mix of musk and fertile earth that made his loins throb with anticipation. After some time he finally managed to rein his desire, by continuously telling himself that, she will his soon, then he could enjoy every single pore of her body and fuck her senseless as much as he want. He heaved and opened his eyes again to look at her seductive body one last time, before laying back down, as to not to be continuously tormented by her primal beauty. He closed his eyes and focused his attention back on the fragments of memories, waiting to be organized. The air was filled with the soft, rhythmic sound of clay meeting palm, the faint crackle of fire, and the distant voices of other villagers outside. His thoughts went back to organizing and dismembering the chaotic memories, and he knew that this was her world. The quiet labor between hunts, the endless work that kept people alive when everything else was falling apart. This was her normal and of most women in the primitive era. From the fragments of memory he carried, he knew her husband had died years ago, during a hunt that went wrong, one of the many hunters who never came back. Completely normal story here. Went out one morning with the others, chasing something through the forest, and the forest chased back. One moment you are the hunter and the other a hunt. That was how it went in this world. You didn't get heroic deaths or final words. Just silence and a body that never made it home. Since then, she'd done what every survivor did. Kept going. The tribe didn't really have jobs. Everyone did whatever the hell needed to be done. The men hunted or made tools. The women also hunted, although some of them and only occasionally, tanned hides, wove cloth, shaped pottery, crushed herbs, watched the kids. If something broke, someone fixed it. If food ran short, everyone went hungry. Lyra was the kind who filled every gap she could. She shaped clay into pots and bowls, wove baskets from reed, stitched animal hide into pouches. Anything that could be traded, and bartered for fruits, roots, and other edible plants and scraps of meat. There was no currency here, no shiny coins or tokens. Everything was barter. Recently she hadn't gone hunting. She stayed home, taking care of him, working, keeping the fire burning, working the clay with quiet focus. Every move was practiced, mechanical, born from repetition. Going through the memories he understood that they weren't just poor, they were dirt poor. The Osari tribe had nothing stable left. They weren't really starving, at least not yet. But they were close. The men were too few, no real hunters, no real warriors, no safety net. The strong ones were gone. The young ones were learning too slow. Real meat was a rarity, shared and divided by the chief, but only when a successful hunt blessed the village, which wasn't often anymore. The number of hunters was dropping every season, and the ones left came back more often empty-handed than not. Most days they lived on fruits, dried roots, nuts, or whatever nature felt generous enough to drop their way. The rare bits of meat were treasured like relics, sealed in clay jars and ash to keep rot at bay, saved for when the cold came crawling down from the mountains. And when winter arrived, it never came alone. It brought hunger, silence, the slow kind of death that didn't scream, didn't fight, just waited quietly. People died quietly too. The old, the weak, the unlucky. There were no funerals, no crying fits. Just a body, wrapped, burned, or buried, and the living kept moving. Because stopping too long meant joining them. Winter didn't care who you were. It didn't care if you were good, brave, strong, or kind. It just thinned the herd and moved on. Reaching here, he took a deep breath and opened his eyes, because it was too heavy. Looking around, he could see it now. The patched walls, the worn tools, the thin smoke curling from a dying fire. They were poor, painfully poor. Yet everything in this place was maintained with quiet care. Every object had purpose, every movement a meaning. He looked at Lyra's hands, the faint cracks, the calluses skin, at the small frown that formed between her brows when the clay didn't shape the way she wanted. She wasn't shaping pots. She was shaping time, buying them both another sunrise, another chance to breathe, another bowl of something warm. This was life here, simple, harsh, but stubbornly alive. And for the first time, he felt the weight of what he'd stepped into. Not just a new world, but a cruel one. A place where every small comfort was earned, every full belly borrowed from tomorrow. He looked at Lyra again, her back straight but shoulders tired, that quiet dignity she carried even when her world had clearly kicked her down a few times. Something twisted inside him. Not pity, not guilt, but a kind of low burning frustration that he couldn't name, especially because he had carried almost all the memories of previous self. This feeling was even more intense. He clenched his fist under the blanket, feeling the remnant of that strange energy. The heat that had just crushed a monster's skull without lifting a finger. He wasn't weak anymore. He had the power too, even though he didn't anything about that yet. And more importantly, he didn't want to live a worthless life again. This time he wanted to live fully and freely. No matter how fucked up the world, he will dictate his own fate. He promised himself right then. No, vowed. He'd get better. He'd protect her. And he'd fix this whole damn food mess somehow. With his knowledge from the future, it couldn't be that hard, right? He had something no one else here did. Modern knowledge. At least in theory. Sure, he wasn't some survivalist alpha who built cabins with bare hands, but just like any other male, he'd read enough to fake it till he made it. Novels, documentaries, random articles, you name it. Back in the old world, before succumbing to the dark side of the world, known as smut novels, he was the type of guy who'd fall down random rabbit holes at 3 in the morning. Watching survival videos. Reading about ancient building techniques. Wondering how cavemen made fire in the rain. He was the kind of guy who'd watch a 40-minute video on how to make fire from bamboo friction while eating cup noodles. He knew way too much about water filtration using charcoal and sand, or how to smoke meat in a pit. Not because he planned to use it, just because he had to know. I think almost any male biological will relate to it. He didn't know why, like any other men, he also had this weird paranoia of getting stranded in a jungle, on sea and stuff like that. That's why he took extra time to study stuff like these. And he'd always been that guy. The type who couldn't rest until he understood how stuff worked. Why soap cleaned. How fire burned brighter with airflow. How to find drinkable water in the wild. Why clay didn't crack when mixed with the right ratio of ash. How salt preserved meat. He knew basic principles like these, so it shouldn't be hard to survive in this primitive world. He smiled faintly to himself. Back home, that knowledge made him a bored nerd with too much screen time. Here, it might make him a goddamn lifesaver. Yeah, he'd never actually done any of it. Never left his room long enough to test it out. But hell, if there was ever a time for useless trivia to pay off, this was it. He leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. His body was still all over, but there was a strange lightness in his chest. That small flicker of purpose he hadn't felt in years. It had been easy to rot in a room when food came in plastic and warmth came from a switch. But here there were no shortcuts, no takeout apps, no heating systems, just raw nature and the people trying to survive it. He started running through the possibilities in his head. Practical, small things first. Traps for rabbits if there were any in this world. Drying racks for meat. Better ways to store food for winter. Maybe simple farming. They had water nearby, right? He'd seen plenty of fertile soil on the way in those borrowed memories. If they could grow something basic, even tubers or grains, it'd change everything. He thought of the old documentaries he'd watched about the earliest humans. How one small trick, like smoking meat or fermenting food, had changed entire tribes. Hell, maybe he could even build a crude granary with mud walls and thatch insulation. It wasn't rocket science. Just logic, patience, and hard work. He chuckled to himself. Great. The guy who couldn't cook rice without a rice cooker is now planning agriculture. Perfect. Still, a grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't hopeless. Not anymore. Whatever it took, he'd figure it out. And for the first time in a long while, the idea of doing something, anything, didn't feel pointless. He wasn't just going to survive this world and enjoy all the beauties. He was going to change it, or at least die trying. Time passed like it always did here. Slow, heavy, and rude. The sun crawled off behind the horizon, left a mess of orange and gray, and then finally dipped below the horizon. Darkness came quickly, swallowing the whole damn place without even a warning. Ant got up and quickly lit up the central hearth in the middle of the hut. It crackled wildly, and its orange glow licking the walls in a wild dance. Smoke curled up and escaped through a hole in thatched roof. She smiled softly at him and said, "Wait a bit for them to come, and then we'll eat together." He nodded. She went further and lit up a hollowed clay cradle filled with melted fat. A twisted plant fiber wick burns with a steady yellow flame. Unlike the hearth's wild dance, the lamp's glow was calm and soft. Finally out the house, she lit up 2 resin-soaked sticks leaning against the wall, their flames sputtering and spitting. Fire was the most essential thing for humans in the primitive times. It was the deciding factor whether they would live or die, as it helps them keep warm, cook food, and deter the wild beasts. After that, she went back to her small corner and continued to work, but this time instead of pottering, she started weaving baskets. He looked outside and it was damn pitch black, without a flicker of light. Even the moon and stars seemed to be hiding today, and with the dark came the sounds. Not some peaceful jungle playlist, but goddamn, howls, growls, and that faint whistle of wind through trees that sounded way too much like whispers of something unseen. Here the wilderness had its own soundtrack, and it definitely wasn't calming or shit like that. Well, it could scare you shitless. A distant howl that didn't quite sound like a wolf but close enough to make his neck stiffen. Something else growled. Something else answered back. Yeah, fun times. The wilderness had a way of making a man honest, stripping away that fake confidence city lights used to give. He'd be lying if he said he wasn't scared. He was fucking terrified. It was wilderness, man. The real deal. Not your forest park with signboards and benches. Here, it was pitch dark, and anything with teeth could be out there right now, sniffing around, and no one would even know your name. Humans weren't top of the food chain here. They instead were just pieces of delicious walking and talking meat. The thought of that thing from before, that nightmare from the Varric tribe raid, flashed in his head. That walking tank of a monster with claws the size of knives and a mouth like a wood chipper. The monster that tore through men like they were toys, and he gulped. Yeah, if that bastard showed up again, all his grand plans about building civilization would end up in a beast shit pile by morning. Right? Civilization builder my ass, he muttered. I'm gonna die in the next chapter at this rate. So yeah, maybe it was smart to stay real quiet and not end up as a late-night protein snack. He gulped, pulling the fur tighter around himself. One random beast walks in and that's it. End of my epic saga. Here lies soul, eaten before the prologue even finished. Real inspirational. He sighed, trying to convince his heartbeat to calm the fuck down. Just as he started thinking he'd die of stress before sleep. Suddenly, the door curtain rustled. A soft rustle of hide and reed. He suddenly froze and almost had a mini heart attack. But soon, various familiar voices drifted. Hearing them, he breathed a sigh of relief. Damn! Scared me, he muttered indignantly. Hearing the voices, Ant also stopped her work and looked towards the source of voices. Lyra's daughters had returned. Yes, did I mention she had 3 ravishing daughters? I didn't. Maybe I had forgotten. Damn, so many memories to organize. He sat up, adjusting his earlier scared shitless self against the wall, as they entered one after another. The flickering firelight painted their faces with shades of amber and shadow. The first was Aurelia, 22 years old, tall, composed, with that same calm expression Lyra had. Honestly, she was spitting copy of Lyra, only younger and less mature, but still had her own younger charm. She was the eldest sister responsible for everything type. She carried a basket slung against her hip, filled with fruits, wild greens, and what looked like herbs. Her dark hair was braided neatly, feathers and beads swaying softly as she moved. Her eyes found him instantly, scanning, assessing, and softening. "You're finally awake," she said gently, setting the basket down near the fire, and hurried to his side. "That's good. I was really afraid, Thanks, Mother Osweria." Her voice was warm, measured, like she was talking to both him and herself. The kind of tone that could calm even the forest outside and the restless thoughts roaming in his mind. Before he could respond, a scoff cut through the air. Vera, the second daughter, 20 years old, stepped in right behind her, tossing her short black hair back and letting out a small huff. "Awake and already lying around again," she said, dropping her bundle of firewood with a loud thud. "Guess near death didn't teach you much about pulling your weight." Sol blinked at her, caught somewhere between confusion and amusement. "Nice to see you too," he said dryly. Her lips twitched, almost forming a smirk before she rolled her eyes instead, because apparently eye-rolling was her main form of cardio. "Try not to pass out again." He couldn't tell if that was actual concern or sarcasm disguised as concern. Maybe both. And then came the youngest, Leora, 18 years old. She slipped in quietly, smaller than the other two, wide-eyed, still looking like she hadn't figured out the world was cruel yet. Her arms full of berries wrapped in a leaf bundle. Her hair was messy, strands falling into her wide hazel eyes as she glanced at him, then froze. "Sol!" she gasped softly, and before anyone could stop her, she rushed to his side, nearly tripping over the mat in the process. "You're really awake. I thought you wouldn't wake up again." Her voice trembled, soft and breathless, every word spilling over the next. She knelt beside him, holding the berry bundle against her chest like a forgotten thought. "I'm fine," he said, though the way her eyes glistened made him feel like a liar. She sniffed, nodding too quickly. "Really? You're sure? You don't look fine." He chuckled. "Well, I look better than dead, right?" That got a small laugh out of her, shaky but still cute. She sniffed and nodded, hair falling in her face. "You promise you won't disappear again?" He laughed under his breath. "I'll try." Meanwhile, Aurelia just smiled faintly, shaking her head. "You see, Leora, I told you he was strong enough. The river always finds its way." Vera snorted. "More like he'll trip and drown first." Aurelia just sighed. "You should try kindness sometime." "Kindness doesn't keep you alive," Vera muttered. "Vera," Aurelia said, her voice still calm but firmer now. "Enough." "What?" "I'm just saying," Vera muttered, crossing her arms, but she didn't push it further. Lyra, who had been tending the fire silently, finally spoke. "You three should rest. Tomorrow will be long. The forest doesn't feed those who wake late." Her tone carried quiet authority, and even Vera didn't argue this time. The daughters nodded, setting down their foraged goods and moving around the room in a smooth, familiar rhythm. For the first time since waking in this world, he saw what life looked like here. The routine, the rhythm, the unspoken coordination between them. The three girls started sorting their stuff, moving around the firelight like they'd done it forever. It was messy, but in a good way. Real. Leora dropped her basket with a heavy thud, wiping sweat from her forehead. Aurelia followed, lowering a large bundle wrapped in broad leaves. Lyra looked at the bundle with a mix of relief and anxiety. She peeled back the leaves to reveal a significant haul. Not just berries, but the carcass of a river hog. It was small, but it was fresh meat, a rare luxury for their family. "The spirits blessed us," Lyra said, but her voice was tight. She touched the meat. It was already warm from the humid air. "But the heat is cruel today. We must cook all of it tonight and eat what we can." "Eat all of it?" Leora whined, rubbing her stomach. "We can't. It's too much. If we don't, the rot flies will take it by morning," Vera snapped, though she looked pained at the waist. "We have no salt to cure it. We'll gorge tonight and starve next week. That's the way it is." A heavy silence fell over the room. The cycle of feast and famine was a brutal law of the primitive world. They had wealth right in front of them, but no way to keep it. Sol watched them from his spot on the furs. He stayed seated, feigning the lethargy of recovery, but his mind was racing. He knew exactly what to do. "We aren't eating it all," Sol said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the gloom. "And we aren't letting it rot." Vera rolled her eyes. "Oh? You have a plan? Are you going to ask the rot flies nicely to stay away?" Sol ignored the jab. He sat up straighter, wincing slightly for effect, but his eyes remained sharp. "We smoke it," Sol commanded. "Smoke?" Lyra asked, confused. "You mean burn it?" "No. Preserve it," Sol explained, his voice taking on a calm and assuring pitch that drew them in. "Fire cooks. Smoke seals. It drives out the water and the flies. If we build a rack over a low fire and use green wood, the meat will last for weeks." "That's nonsense," Vera scoffed, reaching for the knife to hack the beast apart. "I'm not wasting good meat on your fever dream experiments." Sol narrowed his eyes. He didn't have the strength to stop her physically without breaking his cover. So, he turned towards Ant. He knew that she was very tolerating of him. Lyra hesitated a bit, but seeing his confident face she turned to Vera and said, "Let's do as he say." Vera wanted to argue, but seeing Lyra's stern eyes, she swallowed the words back in her throat. "Fine," she muttered, looking away. "But if it spoils, it's on him." Seeing this, Sol smiled and spoke. "Aurelia, get the green wood. Branches that haven't dried. Leora, help me strip the bark. Vera, build a tripod over the hearth." From his seated position, Sol directed them like a general. He showed them how to slice the meat into thin strips to maximize the surface area. He taught them which leaves to burn to add flavor rather than soot. An hour later, the hut was filled with a thick, aromatic haze. The strips of hog meat hung in rows over the smoldering green wood, turning a rich, dark mahogany. The smell wasn't the usual scent of charred flesh. It was savory, complex, and mouth-watering. Lyra stared at the rack, then at Sol. "It's drying," she whispered, touching a piece. "But it's still soft. It's amazing." Others also took turn and tasted it and were equally amazed. Even Vera just crunched her nose and didn't say anything. He just simply sat there, watching quietly, feeling great deal of accomplishment. This was life here. No tech, no bullshit, no background music. Just people who worked all day so they didn't starve tomorrow. And they didn't just live together. They survived together. Yeah, it was chaos out there. Monsters, cold, hunger, death waiting with open arms. But in here, for a few moments at least, it felt like a home. And somehow, sitting there watching them, Sol felt both like an outsider and, strangely, at home. After finally sorting everything out, they sat together and started eating. Dinner wasn't anything fancy. No roasted cartoon tomahawk meat, no stew bubbling in a pot, just roasted hog scraps and fruit. Wild ones they'd also brought back, different shapes, different colors, some bright, some dull, but nevertheless none he could actually recognize. They didn't look like the ones back home either. No perfect supermarket gloss, no stickers or names. Just raw, uneven things ripped straight from trees. Some were too sour, some too sweet, some had this weird smoky aftertaste that was actually kind of addictive. They ate a bit of meat first, then stored the remaining one for later and continue eating fruits, as they were easily available compared to meat. He also took a bite and blinked. "This one tastes different," he muttered, chewing slowly. "Can't even explain it. Just weird." Lyra smiled faintly, seated cross-legged near the fire, slicing another fruit open with a bone knife. The orange glow hit her cheekbones just right, softening the weariness in her face. "You'll get used to it," she said quietly. "Our trees feed us well, if we respect them." He nodded, not sure what that meant but too hungry to question philosophy. Lyra passed him the largest share. A small pile of the sweetest ones, the kind that left a faint honey taste on his tongue. "Eat," she said. "You need strength more than anyone." He looked down at the bowl, then at the others. The girls had smaller shares, noticeably smaller. Before he could say anything, Vera's voice cut in, sharp as always. Why does he get the best ones? She said, narrowing her eyes. He didn't even work. Lyra wasn't surprised. It was almost a daily routine by now, so she didn't even look up from cutting. Because he's hurt, she said simply. He needs energy. You're strong enough to last a night. Vera scoffed, crossing her arms. Hurt or not, he's got both hands. Doesn't he? Can still chew. Aurelia gave her a small look. Not angry, not scolding, just tired. Let him eat, Vera. We can find more tomorrow. The forest always gives back what it takes. Yeah, unless it decides to eat us instead. Vera muttered, but she went quiet, tearing a piece of fruit with her teeth. Aurelia leaned over and placed one extra fruit near him, her expression soft. You need this more than I do, she said gently. You've lost more than just strength. He wanted to say something. A thank you, maybe. But the words didn't fit. He just nodded, awkwardly. Leora, meanwhile, was quiet the whole time, sitting beside him, nibbling on her fruit like a squirrel, eyes flicking between everyone. She kept glancing at his pile. He caught her once, then again, and realized what was coming. Sure enough, the moment the others turned away, she snuck her hand out, grabbed one of the smaller fruits from his bowl, and popped it into her own with lightning speed. He stared. She froze mid-chew as their eyes met. Her expression said, "Don't tell." Wide and innocent and slightly filled with mischief. He couldn't help it. He laughed, quietly under his breath, shaking his head. "You little thief," he whispered. She stuck out her tongue, trying not to smile. "You had too many anyway," she whispered back, voice soft and breathy. Lyra's voice cut through from across the fire. "Leora, eat slowly." "Yes, mother," she said quickly, cheeks puffed full of stolen fruit. They fell into a strange, quiet rhythm after that. The sound of chewing, the crackle of fire, the occasional distant howl outside. Simple, warm, human. Dinner went on quietly for a while. Just soft chewing, the crackle of fire, and the occasional pop of a fruit skin bursting between someone's fingers. The air smelled of earth and sweet pulp. It was simple and peaceful. He was just about to take a bite when something caught his eye. Across the fire, Vera suddenly leaned forward. The crackling flames danced across her face, casting flickering shadows on her features as she leaned forward. Her usual scowl softened just enough to look human. The heat from the fire mingled with the sweat on her skin, causing stray strands of her dark hair to cling to her neck. As she reached for another fruit, her neckline shifted, treating Soul to a tantalizing glimpse of the curves hidden beneath her tunic. His gaze drifted lower, captivated by the small, pert breasts and the delicate pink bud beckoning him from beneath the fabric. The firelight seemed to caress that hidden treasure, making it glow with an almost otherworldly allure. His eyes lingered on the tantalizing sight, his mind racing with forbidden thoughts. He could almost imagine the tender, pebbled skin of her nipple, the gentle pink of the areola, and the way it would pucker as it was grazed by the warm evening air. His gaze drifted to the gap where her fur tunic dipped, revealing the tantalizing curve of her cleavage. His palms itched to trace the soft, feminine contours, to feel the heat of her body radiating through the thin animal hide. As if sensing his gaze, or maybe not, Vera shifted slightly, inadvertently pressing her chest forward. The firelight danced across her skin, casting flickering shadows that made her appear even more alluring. Soul's breath caught in his throat as he imagined cupping the weight of her breasts in his hands, feeling the soft give of her flesh as he rolled her nipples between his fingers. Heat surged through his veins, pooling in his loins as his imagination ran wild. He pictured her lying beneath him, her usual bitchy face turned into a higo, the firelight casting a golden glow over her body as he kissed and licked his way down her neck, over the swell of her breasts, and finally to the delicate pink buds. His tongue would swirl around the tight peaks, drawing out gasps and moans as he savored her sweet, feminine taste. His hand twitched, his fingers curling into a fist as he fought the urge to reach out and touch, to explore the forbidden territory of her body. Swallowing the fruit, suddenly he choked mid-bite, because he was too busy imagining. The sound was loud enough to make everyone look. Lyra glanced up instantly. "Sol? Are you all right?" He coughed, his embarrassment mingling with arousal. "Yeah, just swallowed air." His voice emerged gravelly, strained. Vera's raised brow and smirk made it clear she didn't believe him, her tongue darting out to moisten her lips in a slow, deliberate movement. "Fruit too strong for you, then?" When his breath returned, it came in ragged gasps, his face burning with a mix of embarrassment and arousal. Vera's smirk, her knowing gaze, only heightened his discomfort and desire. Sol coughed again, half from embarrassment, half from the sheer, overwhelming need coursing through him. He knew he shouldn't be ogling her like this, but he couldn't help himself. The fire to press his lips to her newly exposed skin, to taste the salt of her sweat and the sweetness of her flesh. "Nah, just swallowed air," he managed, his voice hoarse. The lie tasted bitter on his tongue, but he couldn't bring himself to admit the truth. Vera's laughter, low and mocking, curled through the air like a caress. "Figures," she drawled. "You'd probably choke on a droplet of dew if you weren't too busy gawking at the sky." Aurelia leaned over, patting his back gently. "Slow down, Sol. The body needs patience, not haste." "Yeah," he muttered, still red-faced. "I'll keep that in mind." As Aurelia's gentle hand patted his back, Sol couldn't help but imagine her touch elsewhere, on his heated skin, tracing the contours of his straining erection. He shifted uncomfortably, trying to hide his growing hardness, but Vera's giggles and sideways glances only intensified his desire. His face reddened due to embarrassment, his own laughter strangled in his throat. He knew she was right, knew he'd been caught in a blatant stare, but he couldn't look away, his gaze helplessly drawn back to that enticing nipple, to the soft swell of her breast. He tried to act normal again, focusing on the fruit like it was suddenly the most interesting thing in the world. But as they continued eating, he struggled to maintain his composure, his focus on the food before him wavering. He could still feel the heat of Vera's gaze, the unspoken challenge in her eyes. And every time his eyes drifted back to that tantalizing curve, he felt a jolt of desire, a vivid fantasy of what it would be like to trace that hidden treasure with his tongue. "You really did choke," she suddenly whispered. Her berry-stained lips curled into a sly, teasing smile. He shot her a glare, but it lacked any real heat, his attention already back on Vera's exposed nipple. The small pink bud seemed to pulse in the firelight, a secret invitation waiting to be claimed. But he couldn't just stare, couldn't let her think of him as some lecherous pervert fixated on her chest, even though there wasn't concept of any lecher or pervert here yet. But still, he couldn't risk leaving a bad impression, if he later wanted to taste that tantalizing bud. So he bit his tongue, forced himself to focus on his food, even as his imagination painted vivid scenarios of tasteful exploration, fingers tracing the edge of her areola, thumbs circling the hardening peak, lips closing over the tender flesh to suckle and tease. The image lingered, a tantalizing ember that refused to die. He could almost feel the weight of Vera's breast in his hand, the velvety softness and subtle give, the taste of salt and woman on his tongue. His throat still burned, his body aching with the unfulfilled need to close the distance between him and the alluring pink bud across the fire. Slowly, deliberately, he let his gaze drift back to that forbidden fruit, the rosy bud that seemed to beckon him closer with each passing second. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his breath coming in short, ragged pants as he fought the urge to abandon all restraint and claim Vera as his own, to lose himself in the primal pleasure of her body under the unforgiving glow of the tribal fires. But still his imagination continued to run wild, painting vivid mental images of his fingers exploring Vera's curves, of his mouth devouring her flesh. He could almost taste the subtle saltiness of her skin, feel the soft give of her breasts as he palmed them, the pert nipple puckering against his tongue. His member throbbed in time with his racing heart, aching with the need for relief. Unaware of the carnal warring within his mind, Vera leaned back, stretching languidly with a low moan. The firelight danced across her skin, highlighting the supple lines of her form. Her tunic rode up, exposing a seductive glimpse of taut flesh. Soul's gaze was drawn to the slight sheen of sweat on her abdomen, the delicate hollow of her navel. He swallowed hard, trying to bring his errant thoughts back under control. It was no use, his imagination continued to run rampant, painting lurid scenes of forbidden desire. He pictured himself trailing kisses down Vera's chest, over the swell of her breasts, until he reached the enticing bud at the center of her cleavage. His tongue would swirl around the sensitive peak, drawing out soft gasps and whimpers as she writhed beneath him. The fantasies were vivid, almost overwhelming in their intensity. Soul's breath came in short, ragged pants, his body slick with sweat despite the cool evening air. His hands itched to touch, to explore, to claim. But he knew he couldn't give in to the primal urges coursing through his veins. Not yet, at least. The fire crackled and spat, casting flickering shadows on the faces of the others around the campfire. Lyra and Aurelia chatted softly, their voices a gentle counterpoint to the pulsing heat building inside Soul. He knew he should join in their conversation, offer some witty remark or jest to lighten the mood. But he couldn't seem to form the words, his mind too consumed by the tantalizing visions dancing behind his eyelids. As the night wore on, Soul found himself stealing glances at Vera, drinking in the sight of her like a man parched in the desert. Her expression was closed off, a mask of haughty indifference masking the desires that simmered just beneath the surface. He knew she felt it too, his attraction, the tension, his primal need to mate. The sounds of the conversations and crackle of fire faded into the background, replaced by the frantic pounding of Soul's pulse and the primal growl of desire in his throat. He felt the primal urge to claim Vera, to bind her to him through the mating dance, to stake his claim on her body and make her his own. Vera's eyes gleamed with challenge, her tongue darting out to moisten her lips in a slow, deliberate movement that sent a jolt of heat straight to Soul's straining erection. She leaned in closer, her breasts brushing against his arm as she whispered, "Want something, Soul?" Her breath was hot against his ear, sending shivers down his spine as he struggled to form a coherent response. I want you," he admitted, his voice rough with need. Vera's smile grew, her fingers tracing the bulge of his loincloth in a teasing caress. "You have me, pet," she purred. "Why don't you show me how much?" Soul's eyes flashed with possessive heat, his grip on her wrist tightening as he pulled her closer. The fire crackled and spat, the shadows cast by the flames dancing across their faces in a primal, erotic display as he claimed Vera's mouth in a searing kiss, his tongue plundering the sweetness of her lips with a hunger that bordered on feral. As their bodies pressed together, Soul felt the world narrow to nothing but the sensation of Vera's curves against his, the taste of her on his tongue, the maddening rhythm of her heartbeat echoing his own. He knew in that moment, lost in the heat of their passion, that he would stop at nothing to claim her, to make her his in every way possible. His gaze hovered just above Vera's exposed nipple. Her skin was warm and soft to the touch, smooth like the petals of a ripe flower. He could smell the earthy scent of her sweat mingling with the heady aroma of ripe fruit, a potent aphrodisiac that made his head spin. With a trembling hand, he reached out, his fingers grazing the delicate curve of her breast. Vera's breath hitched, her eyes snapping to his, a silent plea for restraint warring with the hunger burning in their depths. But Soul was beyond reason, consumed by the primal urges coursing through his veins. His thumb brushed against the stiff peak, coaxing it to aching hardness. Vera's responded by arching into his touch, a low moan escaping her parted lips. The sound was like music to Soul's ears, a siren's call that urged him to claim her fully. Emboldened, he closed the distance, his lips capturing the rosy bud in a searing kiss. Vera's cry of surprise mingled with his own groan of pleasure as he suckled the tender flesh, his tongue swirling around the peak, drawing out sweet nectar. The flavor was intoxicating, a heady mix of salt and woman that made his head spin. As he suckled, his hand slid down the curves of her body, tracing the indentation of her waist, the flare of her hip. Vera's skin was hot to the touch, her muscles trembling beneath his fingers as she surrendered to the pleasure. Soul's other hand delved into the fur tunic, seeking the warmth of her stomach, the softness of her belly. He wove his fingers through the fine hairs, stroking, teasing, coaxing her closer to the edge. Vera's hips bucked against him, her nails digging into his shoulders as she met his every movement with equal fervor. The fire crackled and spat, casting flickering shadows across their entwined forms. But Soul barely noticed, too lost in the sensory storm raging around and within him. With a low growl, he released her nipple, his lips trailing down her chest, over the ridges of her abdomen, to the juncture of her thighs. He paused there, his breath hot against her damp flesh, his tongue darting out to taste the salt and desire that coated her skin. Vera's cry echoed through the night, a primal scream of pleasure that seemed to shake the very earth beneath them. Soul's cock throbbed in response, straining against the confines of his loincloth, aching to plunge into her warmth and claim her fully. Finally, he tore open all of her loincloth and pushed his cock in. Suddenly, with a jerk, he blinked. Oh! And just like that, he snapped back to reality and found that it was all his horny imagination. He was still sitting there, half-chewed fruit in his mouth, while everyone else was busy chatting and eating like normal human beings. Lyra was speaking softly to Aurelia about storing the leftovers. Vera was rolling her eyes at something Leora said, and the fire crackled like it hadn't just been the backdrop to his horny little hallucination. He exhaled sharply through his nose and sighed, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, heart still beating a bit too fast. Maybe it was the hunger, or maybe the fact that he hadn't fully accepted this was his life now. Sitting in a mud hut, sharing fruit with multiple extremely alluring and sultry women, something he hadn't ever imagined in a dream. He leaned back again, eyes on the fire, pretending he was relaxed. Inside though, his brain was still replaying that intense scene. He could still feel the taste of her ripe bud. Man, gotta stop imagining stuff, he thought, dragging a hand down his face. Next thing I know, I'll be seeing ghosts too. The chatter continued around him, soft, warm, domestic. Aurelia's calm voice, Lyra's quiet hum of approval, Leora's giggles blending into Vera's sighs of annoyance. Eventually, the meal came to an end, and the tribe began to disperse, seeking their furs and sleeping platforms. Soul lingered by the fire, his body still thrumming with anticipation. Vera caught his eye, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "Night, Soul," she called out, her voice husky with promise. "Night, Vera," he replied, his own voice low and rough with barely restrained desire. The darkness gathered around him, but it was no match for the intense, all-consuming desires that swirled within his mind, tantalizing and forbidden. As sleep finally claimed him, Soul's dreams were filled with vivid, erotic scenes of Vera's body, her scent, her taste, a sensual feast that left him gasping and yearning for more in the heat of the night. Next day, he was woken up by the bright sunlight stabbing through the cracks in the roof like a dozen nosy fingers poking his face. He tried to ignore it and sleep again, but it was like a nosy neighbor that didn't understand the concept of privacy. He groaned, rolling onto his side, eyes half open. He groaned, rubbed his eyes and sat up slowly. The makeshift fur and hay bed creaked under him. He suddenly noticed that this place was quiet, like a bit too quiet. He looked around and found that Aurelia, Veria and Leora weren't here, and Lyra herself was crouched by the doorway, tying a bundle of woven vines around her waist, and busy checking the edge of a jagged stone knife as if ready to leave too. She looked up when she noticed him awake. "You're up," she said, voice soft but hurried. "Where are the others?" he asked, his voice rasping with sleep. "They have already gone foraging," Lyra explained, tightening the knot. "There's fruit in the bowl. Eat something before it spoils. I have to go. The others are waiting." He nodded. Her lips curved into her signature faint, gentle smile before she turned and disappeared through the doorway, the sound of her footsteps fading into the distance. He was all alone. He looked at the wooden bowl sitting on the floor near his bed. It held breakfast, small yellowish orbs, soft-skinned and slightly sticky, a few with tiny bite marks. "Breakfast, huh?" he muttered, grabbing one. He bit into it and instantly juice exploded across his tongue. Sweet, but not like anything from Earth. There was a faint spice under the sweetness, almost smoky, and the texture was strange, fleshy like a mango but fibrous like sugarcane. But it was good, really good. Damn, he said to himself, chewing slowly. Nature still got it. He sat there eating for a while, watching dust specks float in the sunbeam. The silence was loud enough to make his ears ring. For the first time since waking up in this strange world, he felt the crushing weight of it. No phone, no hum of a fridge, no background noise, no civilization. Just quiet, and only quiet. Honestly, he would be lying if he said he wasn't missing the modern life, phones, internet, delicious foods. But there was no use thinking about it now. He had been reborn into a new world. It was new beginning. Whether he liked the difficulty setting or not. He leaned back against the wall, chewing slowly, letting his eyes wander across the room. The walls were plastered with a mix of mud and grass. A few bone hooks stuck out, holding dried herbs, necklaces, and a clay knife. No furniture, no luxuries, just what you needed to survive. He ate 3 in rapid succession, the hunger inside him feeling less like an empty stomach and more like a starving beast waking up. He finished the last fruit and held the hard, fibrous seed in his palm. He was thinking about this strange world, about the fragility of this life. Unconsciously, his fingers tightened around the seed. Crack. Soul froze. He looked down. The seed, hard as a walnut, hadn't just cracked. It had been pulverized, reduced to wet splinters and pulp in his grip. What the? He stared at his hand. It didn't look like a warrior's hand. It was still the pale, slightly thin hand of the old soul. But the power that had just surged through his forearm felt electric. He pushed himself up. He expected his legs to wobble, to buckle like a newborn deer. Instead, he shot up with a force that nearly sent him stumbling forward. He felt light. Too light. The gravity seemed to have loosened its grip on him. He took a deep breath, rolling his shoulders. The muscles stretched, not with the tight pain of injury, but with the satisfying snap of a loaded bowstring. He felt around his body the weakness was gone, replaced by a humming warmth beneath his skin that made him want to run, to hit something, to move. He frowned, rolling his shoulders. That's weird, he muttered. Bodies don't just fix themselves like that, at least not this fast. It was like the body had skipped the recovery stage and jumped straight to, ready to fight bears again. He rolled his shoulders further, stretched his arms to absolute limit, even squatted a little too wide, but still he felt the body light and flexible. And that brought up the question he'd been avoiding. What the hell even injured the old him? Like really what the heck happened that day? Because his memory of that day was still fragmented mess. He remembers going outside looking for some small prey. But afterwards he doesn't remember what happened, how he was injured, or even how or what even injured him, and what the fucking injury was because, looking at his skin now, he didn't have scar or anything like that. Honestly, whole situation didn't make sense. Unless this body had some serious mutant DNA, or something else was helping him. He didn't like either option. And finally, what the hell was this world, anyway? Sure, it looked primitive, the huts, the rough clothes, the stone tools, but which? Primitive? Caveman? Tribal? Ancient civilization knockoff? He couldn't tell. And that monster from his memory. The Thornimo. That thing with teeth like daggers and a body that looked ripped straight from a paleontology fever dream. Yeah, he didn't remember Earth ever having something like that. Unless he'd missed a Discovery Channel special titled, When Evolution Gave Up and Made Nightmares. Either this was a different world, or the timeline was so far back it had gone full prehistoric DLC mode. He rubbed his temples. The more he thought about it, the less sense it made. He had too many damn questions. Where was he? What time was this? What rules did this world play by? And, most importantly, how the hell was he supposed to survive here without ending up as monster lunch? Still, sitting around won't give me answers, he decided. He needed to go out. He needed to get a feel for the place, map the layout, maybe catch a clue or two about what kind of prehistoric mess he'd landed in. But before that, His eyes landed on the empty water jars near the door. Massive, heavy clay vessels that usually took 2 hands to lift when full. Right? Water first. He decided. Before his injury, fetching water had been his morning duty. Everyone in the tribe had a role. The men usually hunted, the women gathered, the older ones crafted, and the unlucky bastards who were neither strong nor experienced, like him, got stuck with chores. After he'd been injured, Lyra had taken over that too, fetching water after dusk once she was done foraging. Dangerous as hell, but what choice did she have? They needed water. He walked over to the largest jar. Before his injury, dragging this thing to the river was a morning-long torture session. Sol gripped the handle with one hand and heaved. The jar flew up into the air as if it were made of paper. Sol caught it against his chest with a dull thump, blinking in surprise. A slow, feral grin spread across his face. "Okay," he whispered, feeling the power hum in his veins. "Now this is interesting." Sol stepped out into the morning air, the heavy clay jar resting against his hip as if it were made of hollow wood. The morning slapped him awake, cool, damp, and carrying that heavy, earthy smell of wet soil and wood ash. The ground outside was uneven, a patchwork of trampled dirt, scattered bones, and drying herbs hanging from sticks. Looking at the primitive sight, he couldn't help sigh. It really is a primitive world. And remembering that Lyra used to go at dusk or sometime even at night to fetch water, he frowned just thinking about it. The nights here weren't peaceful. They were fucking alive. Crawling, howling, hunting. The idea of Lyra walking out in that darkness, jar in hand, surrounded by who knows. Yeah, it didn't sit right with him. So, now that he could walk around calmly again, he decided to fetch water first. But still feeling the weight of jar. He frowned, shifting the jar in his grip. He remembered picking it up inside. The big one, the one that usually took 2 hands and a lot of grunting to haul to the river. He lifted it up to eye level with one hand. Came up smooth, weightless. He blinked, surprised. "Ha!" he muttered, bouncing it lightly in his palm. Either I'm on steroids or this jar went on a diet. He tested it again, swinging it like a pendulum. Nope, still light. Felt like holding a basket of feathers, not dense. Fired clay. He grinned, shaking his head. Maybe gravity is on leave today. Or maybe I'm just built different now. He didn't dwell on it longer. There was no manual for reincarnation, and standing around testing physics wouldn't fill the jar. He slung it comfortably under his arm and stepped out toward the trail. The path to the river was carved into his brain, the old soul's memory guiding his feet. He took one last glance back at the hut, simple, small, held together by mud, straw, and stubborn effort, and turned toward the village. Their home sat near the outer ring of the settlement. The poor zone, if he had to name it. It wasn't the pretty center area where the chief's family and the elite hunters lived, with their sturdy wooden beams and decorative skulls. This was the outskirts. Here, the huts leaned a little more precariously. The roofs were patched too many times with mismatched reeds, and the firelight from the central bonfires didn't quite reach here at night. That's what poverty looked like in this world. You lived close enough to count as part of the tribe, but far enough away that if something came crawling out of the dark, you served as the first line of defense, or the appetizer. He kicked a loose rock, watching it skitter into a ditch. "Expendable," he muttered. "Front row seats for extinction." He sighed. Then a small, cynical smirk touched his lips. "Guess that's me now." Still, part of him didn't mind it. The edge of the village meant more peace, fewer prying eyes. He could move, think, and plan without being under someone's thumb. He slowed down as he walked, seeing the surroundings properly. The road he was walking on wasn't really a road, just flattened earth, packed by countless bare feet. Huts of straw, wood, and bone lined either side. And it wasn't a huge village compared to the cities he was used to, but it sprawled wider than it looked. As he walked deeper into the settlement, the village woke up around him. Every few huts he saw life. Women grinding something in heavy stone bowls with a rhythmic clack-clack. Men squatting by small fires, scraping animal hides with sharpened bone tools, their muscles corded and tense. Kids ran around half-naked, chasing a round lump of stitched hide that barely counted as a ball, their laughter shrill and happy. It was primitive, yeah, but it wasn't the filthy, mud-caked misery the documentaries back home always showed. The air was clean, crisp, rich with the smell of smoke and wildflowers. The people weren't filthy either. Their skin glowed with health and oil, their rough clothes were worn but washed. We really got lazy, Soul thought, watching a woman casually lift a log that would have given a modern gym-goer a hernia. Out here, everything is a workout. He passed a group of older men squatting near a communal fire pit. They were roasting something long and shiny on a stick. A fish or maybe a lizard. The smell was savory, halfway between charcoal and river weeds. One of the men, a toothless elder with skin like tanned leather, looked up. His eyes widened slightly. Alive after all, huh? The elder grinned, gumming a piece of meat. Barely, Soul replied, giving a tired, respectful salute. The man laughed, shaking his head, and murmured something to his companions. Soul caught the drift of the whispers trailing him. Lyra's boy. Thought the fever took him. Spirit must favor the weak ones sometimes. He pretended not to hear, keeping his gaze forward, muttering a generic greeting to anyone who made eye contact. The further he walked, the more the huts thinned out. The beaten earth gave way to grass and roots. Trees began to replace walls, their massive canopies filtering the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. The path curved downward, following the sound of rushing water. And then the river opened up. The path dipped down into a wide clearing where the jungle pulled back, letting the sunlight spill across the water like molten gold. It was breathtaking. The river was wide, calm, and shockingly clear, like liquid glass weaving between smooth, white stones. He could see the pebbles glittering at the bottom 10 feet down. Sunlight bounced off the surface in blinding ripples. Birds with iridescent feathers circled overhead, crying out in high, clean notes. He just stood there for a moment, letting it wash over him. The smell of wet soil, the coolness of the spray on his skin, the sheer, unpolluted vitality of the place. On the upper bank, people were filling jars and pots with practiced efficiency. On the lower bank, women scrubbed clothes against flat rocks, laughing between splashes. Children splashed in the shallows, their joyful shrieks echoing off the water. It was peaceful. It was vibrant. Okay, Soul exhaled, watching the current flow. Maybe this world isn't all nightmares. He stood there for a moment watching it all. The laughter, the rhythm, the strange beauty of it. Not bad, he muttered. For the middle of nowhere. He crouched down to fill his jar. The cool water rushed over his fingers, clean and soft. It's the cleanest water he had ever seen, even better than that sold for thousands of dollars. Well, being in primitive world also has its own merit, at least he doesn't have to worry about pollution. Suddenly, behind him, someone called his name. Soul! He turned to see a tall young man waving broad shoulders, rough clothes, easy grin. The memory about him rushed forward and he remembered who he was. Taru. The only guy in the tribe the original Soul actually got along with. Closest thing to a friend here. Skinny, weary, looked like he hadn't slept properly in months, but had that annoying grin like life couldn't kill him even if it tried. You're walking around already? Taro said, grinning wide as he jogged over. Thought you'd end up with the ancestors by now. Spirits really like you, huh? Yeah. Disappointing everyone as usual, Soul said, shaking his head. Taru grinned wider. Good. Stay like that or else Vurok and those pissheads will think they won. Them. He remembers those pissheads in his mouth. By a novel's standards, they are the minor villains of everyday life. The kind who didn't kill you but always wished they could. In simple terms, loud, arrogant, useless pricks living off their family's reputations. And if he remembered correctly, they always made fun of him and ostracized him as much as possible, and they were the ones who instigated his previous self to take the hunting right without even training. And just by the extent of haters these memories carried, he knew how much those fuckers tormented the previous self, Even though all he wanted to skin those fucker alive and toss them in wilderness for monsters to eat, the last shred of rationality forced him to calm down, as he had just transmigrated, and even though he had almost all the memories, they were still from the previous self's point of view, not necessarily the reality. So there was great risk of bias, and there was even more of the stuff he didn't know, which required him to explore himself. So he just snorted. They can eat shit. I'm not in the mood. As for taking revenge and stuff, there will definitely be, but not yet. Teru clicked his tongue, lowering his voice. Well, don't give them attention. But did you hear? They're already sniffing around, bragging about how they're gonna get first pick today. Soul froze. First pick of what? Teru leaned closer, eyes darting around like he was passing classified intel. Hunters. They're coming back today. Soul raised a brow. Really? Yeah. Heard it from Koru's wife. Teru whispered very seriously, as if Koru's wife was some kind of oracle. She said she saw the smoke signal from the ridge. Means they'll return before soon. Soul nodded slowly. And you should be ready, Teru added, voice dipping even lower. You know how they are. They'll pretend nothing's left again. Hearing this, a few more memories flashed in his mind, and instantly anger rose in his chest. He remembered the original Soul's memories. Standing in line for the meat distribution, stomach empty, watching those bastards laugh as they took the best cuts and left the smallest pieces for them. Even now, just thinking about it made his jaw tighten. Teru noticed and jabbed his shoulder lightly. Hey, don't look like that. They're waiting for you to make a scene. Soul huffed a bitter laugh. Make a scene? If they try that shit again, I'll shove a bone down. Yeah. Teru cut in quickly. Just be careful. The chief's in a good mood whenever hunters return. Don't get thrown out or something. Soul smirked. Relax. I'm not stupid. Teru raised both brows. You say that, but last week you got angry by them and went for the hunting right and came back half dead. Well, he was speechless. He couldn't say that it was previous Soul, not him. So he kept his mouth shut. Anyways, remember, you fight, you die. You stay quiet, you eat another day. That's the way things work. Soul looked down at the water again, watching how his reflection distorted every time he moved. The river flowed steady, calm, not caring who starved or who feasted. They stood there for a moment watching villagers pass by. A woman carrying a basket gave Soul a warm smile. A kid stared at the clay jar like it was some legendary artifact. A pair of young guys gave him that up and down look, the why aren't you dead yet kind. Teru shoved his hands into his ragged waistcloth and exhaled. Anyway, good to see you well. Soul nodded. Good to be well. Don't get killed. No promises. Teru barked a laugh and slapped his back before heading off, probably to flirt with a girl who'd pretend she didn't see him. Soul sighed, lifting the jar again. Hunters returning meant food. Meat. Real food that wasn't just some weird fruits and even weird roots and wild vegetables. But it also meant conflict. And those pricks weren't gonna let him just stand in line and walk away with a fair share. He already felt that simmering frustration building in his chest. That raw, burning sense of injustice. How much his aunt and the girls suffered. How this tribe treated the weak like trash. How powerless the previous Soul had been. Well, he wasn't the same Soul now. He tightened his grip on the jar. Come, he muttered to himself. Let's see if today's the day I break someone's teeth. He turned to leave, his mind still chewing on the earlier conversation. The sound of the rushing water fading behind him. Something deep in his gut told him that quiet life this tribe had, it wasn't going to stay quiet for long. The walk back felt longer than before. Well, of course it did. Probably because he'd decided to wander through the village instead of taking the straight path. So, yeah, obviously it's gonna take long, no shit. Anyways, the first thing he noticed was obviously the people. Honestly, it's hard to notice them unless you are blind or something. They were literally everywhere. Women doing various chores, such as weaving grass mats, baskets, etc. Kids happily running barefoot without a care, leaving behind the dust, and finally men. The ratio of men to women was pitifully low, like maybe 1 or 2 men for every 10 women, and even they were just mostly young. But what really caught his attention wasn't what they were doing. It was How they looked. In one simple word. Beautiful. Wild. Sun-kissed. Lean and muscular with clear streamlined body shapes. They had that wild, untamed aura to them like coming straight from an aesthetic video game, where creators spent years just making them look pleasing. It's not that there were not many ugly people, but they were absolutely a minority. Heck, then they were more beautiful than many so-called internet influencers with dozens of layers of makeup. Even the older women had this raw, earthy charm to them. Their faces carved with lines that spoke of storms weathered and fires tended. They moved with purpose. Every gesture balanced and confident. Their hair, black or brown or even pale gold, was braided with feathers, beads, or strips of bark that shimmered when sunlight hit them. The younger ones? Yeah, they were walking chaos. Barefoot, wild-haired, wearing animal hide skirts that clung to their hips, skin glistening from oil and sweat. It was obviously not perfumes, just natural raw scents of smoke, berries, wildflowers, and something distinctly human. Nearby, a trio of big-breasted girls haul water jars, their hips swaying rhythmically as they giggle. One of them particularly catches his eye. Tall with dark skin and thick streamlined thighs glistening with sweat. She looked at him and flashed a curious smile before turning away. He had to force himself not to stare too long. "All right," he muttered. "Calm down, caveman brain." But honestly, it was impossible not to. They were beautiful in a way that made your heart speed up and throat dry up. Raw, untamed, unpolished. Like beauty wasn't something they tried for. It was just how they existed. Maybe it's the genes, maybe it's the environment, or maybe all people in this world are so fucking beautiful, as they had this wild, untamed vibe to them. And yet, even among them, the one who stood out the most was undisputedly him. From the memories, he knew that he was handsome. But damn, he really didn't expect this fucking much attention. It was like he was walking on a fashion runaway. Eyes followed him when he walked past as if he was carrying a Koh-i-Noor in his hands. Whispered voices trailed in his wake. Of course, the men didn't seem as entertained. A few frowned openly. One spat on the ground. Another glared at him like he'd just declared himself chief. Soul sighed. Great. New world. Same jealous assholes. But of course, he wouldn't pay attention to these barely kids. He had more important stuff to do, and that was looking at the beauties. Reaching home, he carefully placed the clay jar gently in a corner, even though he had filled it to the brim. But he still didn't feel even a little bit tired. Maybe it's because tribal people are just much stronger than the modern ones. He couldn't help muttering as he stepped back outside. He couldn't help it. The village, or more importantly beauties, pulled at his curiosity like a magnet. He wanted to see properly this time. At least understand what kind of damn place he'd woken up in. The Osari tribe, well, his tribe now, stretched wider than it first looked. Huts made of straw, mud, and wooden frames dotted the open plains like scattered nests. No two were the same. Some were round, some long and narrow, others built half into the ground to stay cool. Paths obviously weren't paved. There were just dirt tracks beaten flat by countless feet. But even then, there was a strange rhythm to them. The further he got into the tribe, the denser the house became, and even though they were seemingly scattered around, they all were in a rough round shape, with the most important places in the village located in the center. Just as he was admiring the primitive aesthetics, suddenly a deep, guttural horn echoed across the whole tribe like a beast had just roared over. For a second, everyone and everything seemed to just freeze. Conversations cut off mid-laugh, hands froze mid-work, heads snapped up. You could almost feel the pause, like the hush that comes before chaos. Then, suddenly, it was like someone threw a bucket of cold water into pouring hot oil. The whole place exploded into motion. People started shouting. Women dropped what they were doing. Kids tripped over each other. The men who had been half asleep suddenly looked like they'd been struck by lightning. The calm noise of the village twisted into a frenzy of voices, shouting, laughter, the scuff of bare feet against packed dirt. And without doubt, everyone was moving toward the same direction, the big wooden gate that sealed the tribe from the wilderness. Soul blinked, jarred by the sudden chaos. What the hell? Then he suddenly remembered, and finally knew what was happening. He calmly looked up, watching the wave of excitement ripple through the crowd. Every person, young or old, suddenly had somewhere to be. He tilted his head, looking thoughtfully. Let's see what happens. He tucked his hands behind his head and started walking with the flow, not rushing like the rest, just following the current of bodies and noise. The dust kicked up around his feet as people ran past him, shouting things he barely caught. Hey, do you think they brought anything back this time? How the heck would I know? I've been right here with you. Did you see them? Over by the ridge. Look. Look. Are they carrying anything? Hard to tell, they're too far. Maybe they caught something this time. Or maybe they didn't. What if they didn't again? Don't say that, hush. But last time they came back empty, remember? Shoo. Keep your voice down. Let's just hope all the hunters are back this time. Hope that the spirits were kind. Well, that was the conversation he had heard all along the way. Snippets tumbling over each other, carried on quick steps and hurried breaths. Some voices were sharp with worry, whispering about whether they'd make it back whole. Others were bright, almost giddy, imagining meat roasting, fires burning stronger. A few were anxious, words tripping over themselves, afraid of silence, afraid of disappointment. The hunters were finally coming back, but unlike other people, he wasn't as much excited. Anyways, the whole air smelled of dust, sweat, and excitement. Everyone seemed to carry that restless spark in their eyes, hope, hunger, relief. For most of them, this wasn't just about welcoming people home. This was survival returning through the gates. Food. Proof they'd live a little longer. By the time he reached the square before the wooden gate, the crowd was thick. People were packed together shoulder to shoulder, craning their necks, standing on stones, tiptoeing just to get a glimpse of what was coming. Some of them even climbed on small rocks or logs to get a better view. There was this raw, primitive kind of joy that rippled through the people, loud and real. You could tell that in this world, nothing was guaranteed. So every small victory, every returning hunter, felt like a damn miracle. The gates were still shut, but even then it made everyone restless. He squeezed through, half annoyed, half curious. Faces all around him glowed with excitement. The hunters' wives whispering near the front, the kids bouncing, elders mumbling prayers under their breath. And yeah, he couldn't help but get caught up in it too. He smiled faintly, trying to blend in, when suddenly a discordant voice stabbed through the noise. Well, look who's out of his hole. The words slid into his ear like sandpaper. It was sharp, mocking, and too damn familiar. Soul's neck twitched, his good mood immediately souring. He turned his head slowly, already annoyed and knowing it wasn't going to be anything good. A small group of teenagers stood off to the side. Muscular, shirtless, cocky little bastards, all trying too hard to look tough. You could tell right away they weren't happy to see him. Their expressions were a mess, some sneering, some smirking, but the same thread ran through all of them, jealousy, and something else, like they'd just seen a ghost crawl out of the dirt. And right in the center stood the biggest asshole of them all. Vurak, broad-shouldered, a bit muscular than others with a smug look on his face. With that permanent, my brother's a hunter, so I can act like a king face. He stared back, frowning. His body tensed, not out of fear, but old irritation bubbling up from memories that weren't fully his but still burned like they were. The one in the center stepped forward. Up close he was tall, had a sharp chin and eyes like a lizard. Vurak. Yeah. The name slid into his head from those half-digested memories of the previous soul. And with the name came the dirt in his mouth again. The shove in the dirt, laughter ringing in his ears. The stolen food, not eaten, but ground into the dirt under Vurak's heel, just to watch him starve. The bruises that weren't his, but still throbbed in his bones. The sneer across his face when he said, "Even your dead parents knew you were useless. That's why they're gone. They couldn't stand you." The laughter when he stumbled, the deliberate trip, the crowd watching and doing nothing, just because Vurak's brother was a hunter, and that made him untouchable. Each memory jagged, incomplete, but sharp enough to sting. And now, standing here, They all came clawing back as if the humiliation had been carved into his own skin. Mockery, hunger, grief desecrated. So much that Vurock's grin wasn't just a face in front of him, but the embodiment of every cruelty he'd ever endured. Unaware of all of this, "Well," Vurock said with that little shit-eating grin of his, "the cripple's walking again. Guess the gods aren't picky about who they save. Huh." He made a clawing gesture with his hand, mimicking a beast's swipe. His little gang laughed, loud and stupid, like it was the funniest thing ever said. But he didn't say anything and just stared in silence, with his jaws clenched together, lips pressed tight, and eyes flat devoid of any emotion, so as to not give him any satisfaction. That kind of silence that isn't obviously weak, but the kind that makes people shift uncomfortably without knowing why. Vurock frowned. "What?" "Nothing to say." Vurock pressed, grin twitching a bit now. "Or did you lose your tongue along with your balls?" That got an even louder laugh. The laughter went on, awkward and forced, but Soul still didn't flinch. He tilted his head, cracked his neck slightly, remembering his and his aunt's situation, exhaled and finally said, in a low, almost bored voice, "You done flapping around your tongue, or must I etch dull shapes on stone, so your slow brain know what sounds to make next time?" Vurock's smirk twitched violently and the laughter behind him also faltered at once. As always, a few of the nearby tribesmen glanced over, whispers starting to ripple, before turning away. Vurock took a step forward, eyes narrowing. "Careful, cripple. Your tongue might work again, but your luck's still shit." "Yeah." Soul tilted his head, still smiling. "So is your face. Guess the gods are fair after all." The words hit harder than any punch could, because he had always been insecure due to his face, and the reason he detested Soul so much aside from other deeper reasons was because of his handsome face. For a second, the world seemed to hold its breath. The nearby chatter quieted just enough for people to notice the shift in air. That sudden tension, the kind that makes you stop mid-sentence because they knew someone's about to get wrecked again. Vurock's face twisted, all color draining before fury rushed back in. He was already angry enough that this fucking bastard dared to talk back to him. But hearing this, his jaw tightened, his knuckles cracked, and that thin thread of restraint snapped clean in half. And without caring about the crowd, he lunged forward with a snarl. His fist tore through the air, fast and ugly. The crowd gasped, half in shock, half in sick excitement. But before the punch could land, Soul was already moving. He'd seen that motion before, not just once, but a dozen times in the fragmented memories left behind by the body's previous owner. That same wild swing, that same dumb arrogance. His predecessor may have been scared, but he wasn't, and he was ready this time. He shifted, knees bending, body leaning just enough. The punch missed by a hair. And then, boom! The loud, guttural horn blew again. The sound rolled through the air, echoing through the village. It felt like the sound rushing through their skulls, shocking everyone present. And as if on cue, everyone turned their head towards the gate, not caring about children's fight anymore. "The hunters!" someone yelled. That one word flipped the mood like a switch. Even Vurock stopped mid-swing, blinking in surprise. The fight, the anger, the insults, all forgotten in a single heartbeat. But Soul wasn't done. Oh no, not even close. Before Vurock could even react, Soul moved and crouched down a bit with a swift twist of his hips, and his fist slammed right into Vurock's gut with a solid, satisfying thud. Varric instantly felt the air escaping with a single choking gasp. His face paled and beads of sweat appeared on his face. Seeing this, Soul flashed a satisfied smile and leaned closer and said in a voice only they could hear, "This is just the start. From now on, I'll make your life worse than death." Without waiting for his reaction, he flashed a cruel grin and slipped away, mixing between people in a flash. Vurock stayed frozen, bent over, mouth open but no sound coming out. His face went pale, sweat popping out on his forehead as pain rolled through his stomach in waves. A couple of his lackeys turned around, confused. They'd missed the whole thing, too busy gawking at the gates like idiots. Boss?" one of them asked. You good? Why you clutching your belly? Wasn't you the one about to punch him? Where'd that bastard go? Vurak's eyes twitched. He took a shaky breath, trying to look normal but failing miserably. I suddenly got a shit? He managed, voice cracking halfway through. They blinked in confusion. And that bastard? Vurak forced a grin. An ugly, twisted kind that looked like his face couldn't decide whether to cry or fart. Of course, ran off with his tail between his legs, that slippery bastard. He wheezed out, voice still shaking from that punch to the gut. His crew nodded right away, not questioning a thing. They already had their script for Soul, well, the old Soul. That quiet pushover who always slipped out of reach just fast enough to avoid a real beating. Even though they still always managed to find him and always gave him a good beating to vent their anger and jealousy. Yeah, a roach. That's what he'd been. The unkillable kind, but still a damn roach. They bought Vurak's bullshit story without blinking. Even patted his shoulder like he was some big man for chasing off the cripple. They didn't question why Vurak was folded over slightly. They didn't question where Soul went. They didn't question why he sounded like every word scraped his stomach raw. Thinking wasn't their strength anyway. Meanwhile, Soul had already disappeared into the river of cheering villagers, the horn still echoing into his ears. Everyone was feverishly looking toward the gates, all smiles and laughter, voices mixing together like a drunk song. And in that chaos, Soul just kept walking, blending in like smoke. His heart was still thudding hard though, that kind of hard you get after a fight. That messy, shaky rush when the anger's still buzzing in your blood. And in 2 lifetimes it was his first real fight, except getting beaten. He didn't know why his body just moved instinctively, and more importantly with the ease he wanted. And from the various memories, he knew that it was a stupid move, maybe even suicidal, something he should have never done. But fuck it. He'd do it again. The second that bastard threw that punch, something inside him snapped. Maybe it was the leftover memories from the body. The bruises, the beatings, the humiliation. Or maybe it was just him, as his old life wasn't any better, even though he wanted to learn fighting and be like those heroes in movies. But alas, life wasn't a movie. Every time something happened he would always be the one to get beaten, even though he really tried to fight back. But life is just a shit show, not caring about your efforts or whims. When he trained enough to fight one bastard, they would bring 2, and when he somehow trained to face off 2, those motherfuckers would bring a whole gang. Man. He really tried, but he really wasn't some main character and didn't awaken any power mid-fight. So, in the end, the result always remained the same, him getting beaten up. Slowly as he grew up, he made peace with the fact that he was just extra in this world, so he was always quiet, always shrinking, always hoping someone else would step in and fix the shit. But no more. If this world wanted to test him, he'd hit back. If this place wanted to kill him, he'd bite its throat first. He didn't care if it was stupid. He didn't care if Vurak came swinging tomorrow with his whole family behind him. He wasn't living like a coward again. He didn't care what the reason was anymore. He'd been through that whole cycle already. The quiet humiliation, the swallowing of anger, the pretending it didn't bother him. And for what? To keep peace? To avoid trouble? Yeah, screw that. Trouble always comes anyway. Might as well swing first. So yeah, maybe it wasn't smart to hit Vurak. Maybe it was the dumbest thing he could have done right now. But he felt alive. Really alive. And that alone made it worth it. He spat to the side, still half grinning, half fuming. Whatever happens, happens, he muttered under his breath. Anyway, ain't dying a coward again. The horn blasted again. This time much longer and deeper. The kind of sound that crawled into bone and made everyone freeze for a heartbeat before exploding into cheers. Faint sound of footsteps and something being dragged was heard. All of the tribe looked towards the gate with a mix of hope and dread, as the guards rushed forward to open the gate. The hunters were finally back. He also paused and looked toward the massive wooden gate ahead, its logs carved with the tribe's old scars and victories, and the same one that kept the wilderness out and their fragile little world safe. With a dull thud, the massive wooden gate was slowly yanked open by 4 strong men, and the first thing that came to view was a carcass. Massive carcass like about 12 to 15 feet tall, his jaw gaping like a split boulder. Blood trailed in dark threads, teeth like knives glinting coldly in the sunlight. The visual spectacle of blood, gore, and its massive jaw was really overwhelming. Then almost immediately the smell of iron, damp fur, and something unexplainable but disgusting hit the nose. The smell was so overwhelming that for a moment he wanted to retch, but seeing the people around him, not caring much about it, he managed to control it. Looking down from the massive carcass, a dozen men came into view, probably hunters, their bodies lean and muscles popping out, and faces were smeared with something red and dust. Look at the size of it. By the spirits, its head alone could feed us for days. The hunters are finally back. See the teeth. They are definitely sharper than stone blades. They dragged the carcass with makeshift vine ropes, lashed around the beast's body, as its legs flopped on one side, guts half exposed, with various innards popping out. Its whole body was riddled with small and large wounds and spears. Even though the hunters also had various levels of injuries and exhaustion etched on their face, but it still couldn't conceal the feeling of pride. For a moment, silence blanketed the tribe. Then, "Ayaha!" Then a moment later people broke out in overwhelming cheers. Some even cried out on the spot, as the crowd moved forward to see the body closer. Some even touched the beast, as if to feel if it was real. What is that thing? But he was still focused on the massive carcass. He tried hard, but still didn't recognize this massive beast. Just then the sound of horn came again, but this one was clearly different. If the one before was loud and warning, then this one was low but majestic. Hearing this, the crowd suddenly went silent, and almost simultaneously turned their heads behind him. "What now?" Soul murmured. He naturally turned around and saw a somewhat handsome and majestic middle-aged man walking with a few strong men. Contrary to common people, their bodies taut with thick muscles, wearing only beast hides around their bodies. But in front of that handsome middle age, they paled in comparison, like comparing a common man to a bodybuilder. The difference was staggering. He almost instantly recognized the man. He was the chief of Osari tribe, Tharun, and undoubtedly the one strongest. The whole damn place folding around him like a shadow. He walked like he owned gravity. Tall, wide, bones that looked like they were carved from raw timber. Tattoos curled up his arms and across his chest. Some marks white with age, others fresh. His face was neutral, with no smile and no fanfare. Just that presence that made you stand straighter without even trying. What the hell? Why do I seem to hate him? But he didn't know what seeing him. An intense feeling of disgust rose in his heart, as if he wanted to punch his smug face hard. He searched his memories and soon found out the reason, as his eyes glinted with intense hatred. But he took a deep breath and calmed himself down. Meanwhile, seeing the tribal chief, the crowd parted in two sides. As he strode forward, dull echo of his feet the only sound in whole tribe at this moment. His eyes lingered on the carcass, the torn hide, the shattered jaw, the spears jutting like thorns, and a slow smile spread across his weathered face. He raised his hand high, the carved bone bracelet on his hand catching the light. "Hunters," he said, voice carrying above the noise. "You have done what few could dream. You have brought down a beast that will feed us, clothe us, and remind our children of your courage. Tonight, the tribe will remember your names." The hunters bowed their heads, pride burning through exhaustion. The chief turned to the gathered villagers, his voice swelling into command. "Prepare the fires, bring out the drums, clean the meat, hang the teeth, and let the blood mark our victory. Tonight, we celebrate not only the hunt, but the strength of our people." A roar of approval surged through the crowd. Women rushed to fetch pots and ladles. Children darted to gather wood, and elders began chanting the old songs. The air shifted from awe to frenzy, laughter, tears, and the pounding rhythm of drums echoing against the walls. The beast lay heavy in the dust, but already it was becoming more than flesh. It was a story, a triumph, a promise. The chief's command rippled through the crowd like fire through dry grass. At once, the village moved. Children raced to gather wood, their laughter sharp against the heavy silence that had hung moments before. Women hauled out clay pots, filling them with water and herbs. Elders struck flint, coaxing sparks into flame. Soon, smoke curled upward, carrying the promise of feast. Drums began, first a single beat, steady as a heartbeat, then more joined, weaving rhythm into frenzy. The sound pulled bodies into motion. Feet stamping, hands clapping, voices rising. The hunters, though weary, were lifted by the crowd. Children touched their arms, elders pressed hands to their shoulders, and the chief himself raised his staff again. "Tonight," he declared, "we dance until the stars burn low. Tonight, we honor the hunt, the fallen, and the living." Even though the whole tribe was celebrating around him, Soul remained silent as he watched everything around him with a calm look, as if the whole thing didn't have much to do with him. Suddenly something, no more like someone caught his eyes. It was a girl. He had seen her from a distance before and thought, pretty. But seeing her up close, he immediately discarded that because she wasn't just pretty, she was simply breathtaking. Unlike the people in whole tribe with tan skin, her skin was pale, so pale that it seemed to suck the color out of nearby things. White hair braided with tiny bones and silver eyes that looked at everything around her with indifference, as if the whole tribe didn't matter to her. Her face was cold and indifferent. Her cold gaze passed across the crowd, and it landed on him. A single look, contempt so casual it could have been a tick. No dramatic sneer, no elaborate disgust. Just that tiny, dismissive flick, as if he were a stain on her dress. The sting dug into him harder than the punch from Vurok. He wanted to say something. He wanted to spit back a line that would twist her head. He wanted to rip off her flawless face like a mask and show what she really was. But before he could do or say anything, she turned and left, leaving him standing there confused. What the heck was that? Then, as if some deeper memory fragments clicked in, and he remembered who she was. She was Saloon, the literal moon of Osari and Chief Tharun's daughter. The White Swan, the one even elders whispered about with that weird mix of respect and caution. The girl blessed by the shamans at birth. The tribe's so-called future. Their pride. Their untouchable treasure and whatever title they slapped on her. A flood of specific memories washed over him, of course not his own, but belonging to the body he now inhabited. Going through the memories, "God, you sad bastard," he muttered and couldn't help shaking his head. As for what they were, well, in simple terms, the previous soul had been simply pathetic. As one of the most handsome men in the village, he didn't have any shortage of suitors, but he had only been infatuated with her. He had been the toad gazing up at the white swan, worshipping the ground she walked on. And that look she just gave him? It wasn't new. It was the same look she had given him 3 years ago when he had foolishly tried to offer her a polished river stone, a token of affection. She hadn't even rejected him verbally. She had simply walked around him, careful not to let her furs brush against his skin, as if he carried a plague. "Great," Soul muttered, rubbing his temples. "Not only am I weak, but I'm also the village stalker. No wonder she looked at me like I was fresh dung." He shook his head, forcibly dispelling the lingering emotions of the previous owner. Shame wasn't useful. Anger was better, but right now hunger was the strongest of all. By now, the atmosphere in the tribe had shifted from chaotic excitement to organized festivity. The massive carcass was already being dismantled. Skilled butchers were slicing through the thick hide, mostly older women with arms like knotted wood and men who had retired from the hunt but knew the anatomy of a beast better than their own wives. They didn't hack mindlessly. They worked with surgical precision using tools of chipped obsidian and sharpened bone. Soul watched in fascination as 2 men climbed onto the ribcage. One grunted, "Push harder, Leko." "I am pushing." They jammed wedges into the sternum. With a wet, tearing sound that made the crowd shiver in anticipation, the thick hide was peeled back like a heavy rug, exposing steaming layers of dark red muscle and thick slabs of yellow fat. The heat radiating from the open body was visible, rising in faint misty columns against the cooling evening air. Nothing was wasted, not even a single drop. Younger women moved in a coordinated rhythm, shoving large clay pots under the severance points to catch the thick, dark blood before it could hit the dust. It would be boiled into a soup or mixed with meal for the warriors. Others grabbed the spilled intestines, dragging the glistening gray ropes, yards long, toward the river to be emptied and washed for casings. Then came the cracking of bones. Men with heavy stone mallets smashed the massive thigh bones, splitting them open to reveal the rich, gelatinous marrow inside. A delicacy reserved for the elders and pregnant women. The smell of raw iron was replaced by the mouth-watering scent of fresh meat as they cut open the beast in different parts. Just by looking at it, he couldn't help gulp. How long had it been since he last had the meat? He watched as the best cuts, the liver, the heart, and the tenderloin were carried ceremoniously toward the chief's elevated platform. The hunters received large, bone-in slabs, laughing as they tore into the remaining flesh, grease running down their chins. The elders and the women were given the next shares, decent cuts of flank and shoulder. But as the meat was distributed down the line, the portions grew smaller and the quality dropped. By the time it was the turn of those living on the outer edge, the dregs of the tribe, there was little left but tough neck meat and a few more chunks. Sol watched it with a tight jaw, his chest buzzing like someone had kicked a hive inside his ribs. People around him, the other outcasts, tried to make peace with their lot, murmuring soft platitudes to comfort themselves. That's how it's always been. We need the hunters strong. They protect us. Don't complain, at least we get something. Better than starving. Sol hated this defeatist shit. It was the mantra of the weak, the lullaby they sang to themselves to accept their place in the dirt. He waited in line, but every time he stepped forward, he was deliberately stalled. Wait! The distributor would grunt, waving a family past him. Not yet. He was pushed to the very last, forced to watch the pile dwindle until the fires were dying down and the celebration was quieting. Even though anger simmered in his gut, he endured it, his face a mask of stone. Suddenly, the murmuring around him changed. People stepped back, their voices dropping to fearful whispers. Sol looked up from the dust, and that's when he saw them. Vurok and his lackeys were standing right in front of the remaining meat pile, acting as if they were the ones who had brought the beast down single-handedly. Vurok seemed completely fine from the punch Sol had landed earlier. In fact, he looked energized by spite. He was scanning the thinning crowd, eyes hunting, until they locked onto Sol. A grin spread across his face, a real greasy one, the kind that said, "I'm going to enjoy this." "Well, here comes the trouble," Sol muttered helplessly, but he didn't flinch. He folded his arms and stared right back. Everyone in the village had a right to meat. It was the oldest rule of the tribe. If you were part of the Osari, you ate. No one could deny it. Not even the tribal chief, let alone a petty bully. Otherwise, there would be no reason for the tribe to exist. Everyone did their own share of work for the tribe, and in exchange they got food and safety. That's how the system worked in the savage world. So Sol didn't feel anxious. He just stared ahead with cold, calculating eyes, waiting to see what kind of shit they were going to stir. When his turn finally came, most of the crowd had dispersed to their huts to feast. The group of boys who hung around Vurok like flies on a wound had already secured the best remaining chunks. The old man in charge of distributing, a withered elder with cloudy eyes, waved Sol forward with a dismissive hand. "Your turn," he muttered, tired and done with this day. Sol stepped up, ignoring the fatigue on the old man's face, though his chest was already burning with a low, steady anger. Immediately, Vurok stepped in front of him, blocking the path to the meat. He stood with a heavy hand on his chest, smirking like a dog sniffing something rotten. "Well, well," Vurok drawled, his voice loud enough for the lingering crowd to hear. "Look who crawled out of bed to beg." Snickers erupted from the lackeys standing in the shadows behind him. Sol didn't move the hand off his chest. He didn't shove back. He just looked at the hand, then slowly lifted his gaze to Vurok's face. He stared him dead in the eyes with an intense, silent warning. A look that didn't belong to a crippled boy, but to a predator. Seeing this look, Vurok couldn't help but flinch. The memory of that earlier punch flashed through his mind. The shock, the pain. He coughed awkwardly and instinctively removed his hand himself, stepping back half an inch. But the moment he did, he realized what he had done. His face flushed red. He remembered his status, his size, and his audience. Anger surged back hotter than before. He couldn't believe he had just been scared by a cripple. Soul didn't care much about his internal conflict. He had already died once. He didn't give a damn about dying again. "I'm here for my share," Soul said coldly. "Share?" Vurock barked out an angry laugh, desperate to regain face, looking around at his friends. "What share? There's nothing left." Soul shifted his gaze to the old distributor, expecting the elder to intervene and uphold the law. But the old man just coughed awkwardly and turned his gaze away, pretending to be suddenly fascinated by the edge of his obsidian knife. Soul lifted a brow. He pointed a stiff finger past Vurock's shoulder, directly at the pile of remaining flesh. "Then what is that?" "Oh, those are for storage," Vurock snapped immediately, the lie coming out smooth as if he'd rehearsed it. "Winter's coming. Everyone knows that. We have to stock up." Soul stared at the pile. There were still decent chunks there. Leg muscles, some ribs with fat still clinging to them. Nothing huge, but definitely meat. And he didn't buy the excuse for a second. Winter was still months away. The tribe never started preserving this early in the season. "Everyone in the tribe has a right to meat," Soul said, his voice dropping an octave, pronouncing every syllable like a hammer hitting stone. "It is the law." "Oh, is there?" Vurock tapped his chin, feigning deep thought. "Let me think. Oh, now that I think about it, you're right. There really is." Vurock's face suddenly twisted into a sneer. "But what can we do? You have to think about the tribe. The hunters hunted with so much effort, risking their lives. We can't waste good meat on waste like you." Hearing this, the lackeys behind him started laughing loudly, making various mocking noises. They chimed in, eager to please their leader. "Yeah, right?" one shouted. "My father almost died hunting that beast. Why should you eat his kill? Go eat grass, just like the bastard you are, cripple," another jeered. "Feeding him is like throwing meat into a swamp. Useless. You can't even lift a spear. Why do you need muscle?" Soul turned to look at them one by one. They were all the children of hunters or elders, young men being trained as the next generation of warriors. They reeked of arrogance and unearned pride. He then turned around to look at the few remaining villagers still hovering nearby. Wherever his gaze went, they turned their heads away, suddenly interested in the dust or the sky, acting as if they hadn't seen or heard any of this injustice. Seeing this, Soul couldn't help but laugh. A short, cold sound. He knew from the previous Soul's memories that he was ostracized, but he didn't expect the rot to be this deep. The whole tribe was complicit. "What are you laughing at like a madman?" The laugh ticked Vurock's nerves. He stepped forward aggressively, raising a fist, but then the phantom pain of his jaw stopped him. He awkwardly stepped back again, unsure. Soul stopped laughing. His face went deadpan. "I am here for my share." He didn't shout. He just stated it as an absolute fact. Then he looked at the old man again. This time, the intensity in Soul's eyes was too much to ignore. The old man, feeling the pressure of that gaze, couldn't help but cough loudly toward Vurock's direction. A subtle signal to just end this. Vurock understood the signal. Give him something to make him leave. Okay, Vurock sneered. "You want your share? I will give you your share." Saying this, he bent down, rummaging through the dirt near the bottom of the pile. He bypassed the good meat, digging until his hand found something discarded. He stood back up, grinning, and shoved something wet and slimy into Soul's hand. It was a piece of connective tissue attached to a shattered shard of bone. Gray, tough, covered in dust and hair. It was barely edible even for the dogs. "There," Vurock said smugly, wiping his greasy hands on his furs. "Your share. Now get lost." Soul looked at the pathetic scrap in his hand, then at Vurock's smug grin, and finally at the old man who was actively avoiding eye contact. He laughed. A low, cold sound that started in his chest and scraped its way up his throat. It wasn't a laugh of humor. It was the sound of a dam breaking. But instead of shouting, he calmly extended his hand and took the piece of meat. Seeing this, the old man breathed an audible sigh of relief. His shoulders slumped. As long as Sol took the piece, the transaction was complete. The law was technically upheld. He got his share, so no one could blame him now. Vurok and his lackeys burst into laughter, slapping their thighs. Yeah, that's how it should be. Good dog, take the bone. Take it like the bastard you are and scram. Sol didn't move. He stood perfectly still, calmly weighing the piece of meat in his hand like a stone. Then, without a flicker of warning, he suddenly lunged. He moved with a speed that belied his lean frame, instantly closing the distance with Vurok and slammed that wet, heavy chunk of bone and gristle directly into the dead center of Vurok's face. Thwack! The sound was sickeningly wet, a mix of slap and crunch. Vurok didn't just stumble, he was lifted off his feet. He flew backward as if kicked by a mule, his arms flailing uselessly in the air. He landed squarely on his back in the butchery pit. A patch of ground churned into a slurry of mud, blood, and discarded entrails. He hit the slime with a wet splat that echoed through the sudden silence, sliding a few feet due to slipperiness before coming to a halt, his face coated in the filth. Everyone froze. The laughter died instantly, choked off in the throats of the lackeys. They stared, eyes wide, at their leader sprawled in the filth. Sol didn't even breathe hard. He just calmly dusted his hands, wiping the grease onto his trousers. Under the shocked gaze of the crowd, he spoke, his voice calm but carrying a weight that drilled into everyone's ears. Shove it up your ass. If this trash is so good, I'll hunt my own food. Saying that, he turned and walked away coolly, his stride steady, as if the violence that just occurred had absolutely nothing to do with him. Vurok's lackeys looked from Sol to Vurok and back again. Some shifted their weight, wanting to rush forward and stop him, but they hesitated. There was something terrifying about Sol's calmness, a dark, heavy aura that pinned their feet to the ground. They didn't dare take a step. On the ground, Vurok lay dazed, staring up at the darkening sky. His brain was swimming in a thick fog. What happened? I was standing just now. Why is the ground wet? Why is the sky spinning? Did the moon fall on me? The world felt tilted. He blinked, trying to clear the red haze from his vision. Seeing Sol walk away, the lackeys finally snapped out of their trance. They scrambled toward the mud pit, panic on their faces. Boss, are you okay? Vurok, can you hear me? Damn it, help him up. The shouting pulled Vurok back to reality. The pain in his nose registered first, followed by the cold slime soaking his back. He remembered. Sol, the meat, the wet slap. He struggled to sit up, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He opened his mouth to roar a curse, but just then, he felt something in his mouth. A small, gritty lump. Instinctively, like a reflex, he bit down and swallowed. Crunch. Gulp. A bitter, foul taste exploded on his tongue. A taste of rot and half-digested grass. He froze. His eyes bulged. He finally realized what he had just swallowed. The scrap Sol had hit him with wasn't just muscle. It was a piece of the beast's lower intestine, the part where the dung was stored, and he had just eaten it. The smell hit him a second later. Vurok's face turned green. Around him, the crowd gasped. Even his own lackeys recoiled, stepping back and covering their noses, looking at him with undisguised disgust. It was as if they were fighting the urge to retch just by looking at him. Urgh! Vurok doubled over, his hands clawing into the mud, and puked. He vomited violently, emptying his stomach onto the ground he was sitting on. After finally retching everything he had eaten since yesterday, he wiped his mouth, tears of shame and rage stinging his eyes. He looked up at the retreating figure of Sol, now far in the distance. "SOL!" he screamed, his voice cracking, trembling with humiliation. "You just wait. I'll kill you. I swear I'll kill you." Even though Sol could hear the angry curses fading at his back, he didn't care. He continued walking forward, his steps lighter than they had been since he woke up in this body. He felt a profound, vibrating sense of satisfaction, as if years of stored farts had finally been released all at once. Ahem. Okay, that example is a bit too disgusting. Let's try again. It felt as if years of accumulated anger and suppression were finally washing away, leaving his mind clear and sharp. Once the initial rush of adrenaline and satisfaction faded, the cold air hit his face, bringing him back to reality. His pace slowed slightly as he began to calculate the fallout of this little saga. One thing was absolute. Vurok was not the type to let this rest. The man was a petty, vindictive bully who thrived on fear. Sol had just shattered that fear in front of the entire village. He's going to want blood, Sol muttered to himself, kicking a loose stone. Probably a lot of it. However, he wasn't overly worried about the official channels. Even though his actions were excessive, remembering Vurok's shit-eating expression, perhaps a little too excessive, Sol knew the tribal politics. It was Vurok who had broken the law of distribution first. More importantly, Vurok was proud. Would the son of a lead hunter run crying to the chief or the elders? Would he admit that a cripple had slapped him to the ground and fed him a piece of dung-filled intestine? Not a chance, Sol smirked. He'd rather die than publicize that he ate shit. If that story gets out, he'll never lead a hunting party in his life. He'll be the laughingstock of the Osari until the day he dies. So, the elders wouldn't be coming for him. The chief wouldn't bother with a squabble between children that left only one real threat. Vurok and his lackeys taking matters into their own hands. They would come for him in the dark, away from prying eyes, looking to break a few bones to restore their lost honor. It will be difficult, Sol admitted, looking down at his own lean, malnourished arms. In a fair fight right now he would lose, but his eyes didn't hold fear. Instead, a dangerous glint appeared in them, sharp as obsidian. If I can manage to raise my strength through that method, he whispered, his mind locking onto the soft, sensual hand of Ant as she gave him a handjob, then I won't need to be afraid of them. In fact, they should be the ones afraid of me. As he navigated the winding dirt paths leading away from the butchering area, as Sol walked, his thoughts drifted to his aunt and cousins. The satisfaction of hitting Vurok began to sour into a heavy lump in his throat. Even though, in the past, the distribution wasn't usually this catastrophic. Sure, they were always last and they always got the worst cuts, tough flank, neck meat, or scraps of fat. But it was usually edible. The previous Sol had been a master of invisibility. He would keep his head down, hunch his shoulders, and swallow every insult Vurok threw at him just to secure a few strips of protein for his cousins. It's because of me, Sol realized, his jaw tightening. It's because I punched Vurok this morning. But as the guilt flickered, a hotter, heavier anger surged to replace it. He finally realized why they hadn't been at the distribution. It wasn't that they didn't know the hunters were back. The horns were loud enough to wake the dead. The ground had practically shaken with the tribe's cheers. There was no way they didn't know. They knew, Sol muttered, kicking a stone into the darkness. They knew the hunters were back, and they chose not to come. He understood why. It was the shame. To stand in that line, surrounded by the sneers of the strong, holding out a bowl like a beggar only to receive pity or scorn. It was a soul-crushing ritual. His aunt, a woman who had once held her head high, likely didn't come knowing that they definitely wouldn't receive something edible. And it wasn't just them, it was the same for all the people living in the outer edges of the tribe. So where were they? The answer hit him with the force of a physical blow. Foraging. They had likely gone foraging in the outer jungle. While the tribe feasted safely within the walls, his family had likely slipped out the back gates to scour the fringe of the jungle for roots, berries, or perhaps, if the spirits were kind, a small rabbit or rodent. The thought made Sol's blood run cold, then boil. The outer jungle wasn't a garden. It was a death trap. It was the domain of prowlers, poisonous insects, and carnivorous flora. It was a place where grown men with spears walked cautiously, especially for women and children without warrior protection. They were risking their lives for berries and roots because the tribe they belonged to treated them like parasites. Damn them, he hissed, kicking up a cloud of dust. My aunt has to scrape through the dirt while these bastards glut themselves on meat. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. The injustice was a physical weight on his shoulders. Just then, a coarse sound snapped him out of his thoughts. The sound of rustling fabric and heavy, panting breath. He snapped his head toward the noise, irritation flashing in his eyes. In the shadow cast by a mud-walled hut, where the afternoon sun fell in harsh slants across the packed earth, he saw a couple. It was one of the newly returned hunters, a man Sol recognized instantly just because of one particular reason, because had a face like a flattened yam, with a squashed nose and uneven teeth, and square face. And this bastard was tearing the clothes off a woman. Sol's eyes widened, not because of their action, because it was extremely common, it was because the woman was extremely stunning. Even in the dim light, her beauty was undeniable. She had the wild, raw allure of the primitive era. Skin the color of burnished copper, long, tangled dark hair that flowed down her back, and a body that was ripe and full. Her curves were barely contained by the rough hide she wore, her legs long and powerful. She seemed to be struggling, pushing at the hunter's chest, but not hard enough to stop him. It was the struggle of someone who had resigned herself to this. Damn, Sol muttered, his face twisting in disgust. These people are really shameless, not even caring about the place or time, just rutting like beasts in the street. He wanted to look away, but his eyes were glued to the scene. The hunter's rough hands were mauling her delicate skin, his ugly face trying to bury itself in her neck. Despite his anger, a jolt of heat shot through Sol's lower belly. He was a young man, and since waking up in this world, he had continuously been triggered, and even though Aunt had given him a hand job, what he wanted was to push her down and fuck her mind up. And now seeing the sight of her exposed skin, the curve of her breast as the hunter tried to yank her top down, it ignited a fire in him that conflicted violently with his rage. This ugly bastard gets to touch her. Sol thought, his jaw tightening. And I'm supposed to just walk by? Seeing that he couldn't remove her clothes, that bastard decided to remove his own clothes first. Sol's arousal mixed with his fury until he couldn't distinguish one from the other. The unfairness of it all, the meat, the power, the women, it all belonged to the strong, while the weak were expected to disappear. Enough! Sol barked out almost without thinking. The anger boiled over, and he shouted at the hunter, his voice lacing with a strange, vibrating intensity. Stop! Get the hell out of here! He expected the hunter to curse him, maybe even attack him. But what happened next made Sol freeze. The hunter stopped instantly. His hands dropped from the woman's body as if he had been burned. His lust-filled eyes suddenly went blank, then fearful. Without saying a word, he pulled his furs back up, turned around, and walked away into the darkness. He just left. Sol stood there, mouth slightly agape. The beautiful woman was left standing against the wall of the hut, her clothes in disarray, looking completely bewildered. She blinked, looking at the retreating hunter, then at Sol. Sol gulped, staring at his own hands. What is this? Is this me? He needed to confirm it. His heart was pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. The arousal was still there, now mixed with a darker, intoxicating curiosity. He looked at the woman. Her breathing was ragged, her skin flushed. You, Sol said, his voice trembling slightly before he steadied it. Lift your arms up. He looked at the woman. Her breathing was ragged, her skin flushed. You, Sol said, his voice trembling slightly before he steadied it. He felt a strange, terrifying heat he had felt the night he destroyed the bed. That volatile, prismatic storm that had cracked the earth. But he didn't care about that, as he was consumed by lust at this moment. Lift your arms up. To his utter surprise, the woman didn't argue. She didn't ask who he was. She simply smiled, a vacuous, compliant smile, and lifted her arms high, exposing her smooth, pale armpits to the cool air. Soul felt a rush of blood to his head that made him dizzy. It worked. She was listening. He took a step closer, the darkness in his eyes growing. The inhibition that usually held a man back was crumbling under this newfound power. "Show me," he commanded, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. "Show me everything. Take it off." The woman nodded, as she playfully winked at him. Slowly and deliberately, her hands moved to the final fastenings of her skirt, a rough band of cured leather. With a simple tug, the knot came loose. Gravity did the rest. The hide skirt slid down her hips and hit the dust with a soft whump. Soul stopped breathing. The soft afternoon light spilled across the courtyard, dancing across skin that was smooth and rich, the color of burnished copper. She wasn't like the starving, withered women on the outskirts of the tribe. She was full-bodied, healthy, a prize of the tribe. Her breasts were heavy and round, spilling out with a natural, unsupported weight, tipped with dark, large nipples that hardened visibly in the cool afternoon air. Her waist dipped inward before flaring out into wide, fertile hips and strong, muscular thighs, legs that were powerful, built for survival, yet maddeningly feminine. Between her legs, a dark, neat patch of hair drew his eyes like a magnet. She stood there, completely exposed, her hands resting idly by her sides, her expression placid, waiting for his next command. Soul felt a dryness in his throat that had nothing to do with thirst. His heart hammered against his ribs, threatening to crack them. He had seen women before in his previous life on screens in magazines. But this raw, unfiltered, primitive nudity standing inches away from him was something else entirely. The smell of her, a mix of wild herbs, sweat, and woman, filled his nose, clouding his judgment. He took a step closer, the arousal in his veins now mixing with a terrifying sense of omnipotence. "Real," he muttered, his voice hoarse. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and brushed his fingertips against the side of her breast. It was warm, soft, incredibly elastic. She didn't flinch. She didn't scream or slap his hand away. She just let out a soft, breathy sigh and leaned slightly into his touch, her silver eyes fixed on him with total submission, like a trained pet. The realization crashed down on Soul harder than the beast's carcass. The hunter hadn't left because he was scared. The woman wasn't stripping because she liked him. They were obeying. "Holy shit," Soul whispered, his hand gripping her soft flesh a little firmer, watching her reaction. "I can do anything." His fingers slowly moved down, tracing the curve of her sensual hips, digging slightly into the plush flesh. She felt solid, warm, and incredibly alive under his touch. It wasn't a dream. The rough texture of goosebumps rising on her skin from the cold air was real. The rapid pulse fluttering in her neck was real. "Kneel," Soul whispered, the words slipping out before he could even process it. Without a second of hesitation, the woman's knees hit the dirt. She sank down before him, her heavy breasts swaying slightly with the movement, her silver eyes looking up at him with that same eerie, blank adoration. She looked like a devotee before an altar, and he was the god she was praying to. A dark, twisted grin spread across Soul's face. The humiliation of the meat distribution, Vurock's sneer, the cold arrogance of the chief's daughter. It all seemed to shrink in the face of this absolute control. Here, in this shadow, he wasn't the cripple. He wasn't the waste. He was the master. He reached down, tangling his hand in her thick, dark hair, pulling her head back to expose the long line of her throat. He could take her, right here, right now. He could force this hunter's woman to service him in the dirt, and she would probably thank him for it. The thought sent a jolt of lust straight to his groin, hard and demanding. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, smelling the musk of her skin. "Open your mouth," he commanded. She parted her lips instantly, her tongue resting wet and pink against her teeth. Soul stared into that open mouth, his heart pounding like a war drum. He was on the edge, ready to unfold his fur clothes and lose himself in this newfound power. But just as his hand moved to his waist cord, a sudden rustling came from the bushes nearby. Arg! He flinched, stumbling back a step, hand tightening around his loincloth. The world seemed to tilt for a fraction of a second, shadows shifting, black spots dancing in his vision. The sound cut through his lust-fueled trance like a blade. The cold afternoon air rushed back in, cooling his heated skin. He blinked, shaking his head, forcing the dizziness away, ears straining for another hint of movement. As he looked around quickly, paranoia suddenly replacing the arousal. They were in an alley between huts, but they weren't invisible. The sounds of the feast were loud, but people were moving around. If anyone walked by and saw the village cripple standing over a naked woman, the spell might not matter. A spear through the back would kill him just the same. He was physically weak. If the mind control broke or if the hunter returned with friends, he was dead meat. Not here, he muttered, breathing heavily, forcing his zipper hand down. Too risky. Not yet. He looked down at the woman, who was still kneeling, still waiting with her mouth slightly open, oblivious to his internal crisis. The sight was pathetic and terrifying all at once. He needed to get out of here. Get up, Soul hissed, as he gulped looking at her exposed body. She stood up immediately, the spell apparently unbroken by his moment of weakness. Soul watched her, his mind racing. He had a weapon, a terrifying weapon, but he didn't know its limits. How long did it last? Did it wear off? Would she remember this? He couldn't risk her running to her hunter husband crying about the boy who made her strip, but he also couldn't let go of this chance. No, Soul whispered, the word lost in the heavy, musk-filled air between them. I'm not stopping. He didn't pull back. The darkness that had been festering in him, fed by Vurock's scraps, by the chief's indifference, by the sheer brutality of this world, finally snapped the leash of his restraint. He looked down at the woman, at her seducing silver eyes that held no judgment, only absolute, terrifying obedience. Good girl, he breathed, his hand moving from her hair to the back of her neck, guiding her inside the house. /N, just to be clear for some impatient ones, it's not hypnosis and will never be. Both me, author, and Soul, MC, hate hypnosis. Sex is a sacred union of men and women and should never be defiled with disgusting stuff like hypnosis. This power is a much higher level of power, and is explained in next few chapters. Thud. He didn't wait for the door to latch. The moment they crossed the threshold into the dim, musk-scented darkness, he slammed into her from behind. Oof! The air left her lungs in a sharp rush as his chest collided with her back, pinning her body between his hard frame and the stagnant air of the room. Compared to outside, it was a bit dark inside, as the windows were half closed, sealing them into the semi-darkness of the hut. It smelled of dried furs, old wood, and now, the overpowering, dizzying scent of aroused musk. But he didn't need light. The heat radiating from her body was a beacon, pulling him in like a moth to a consuming flame. No words were spoken, as there was no need for words when the air itself quivered, charging with a hunger that felt almost violent, and raw enough to consume them both. His arms wrapped around her body tightly, a true clasp of possession, pulling her back against him until there was no space left between them. The sensation was absolutely heavenly. A primitive satisfaction that no other thing could ever compare. Skin against skin, the softness of her buttocks pressing against his groin, the firmness of her flat, toned stomach under his palms. Mine, he growled, the sound tearing from his throat, raw and starving. You're mine. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling sharply. Sniff, the intoxicating scent of her sweat, wild herbs, and the raw, feminine musk almost drove him insane. Oh, she whimpered, her head falling back onto his shoulder, exposing her throat to him. Seeing this, he became even more agitated and didn't just kiss her. He devoured her. His tongue dragged wet, hot stripes up the sensitive column of her throat, tasting the salt of her sweat and the wild herbs caught in her skin. He lapped at her nape like a starving animal tasting its first kill. He bit down on her nape, a possessive graze that made her shudder and arch into him. Ah! She shuddered violently, arching back against his erection. Her body reacted to the sheer, chaotic intensity of his touch. It was really like a dam breaking, years of being a virgin. All the pent-up desires, all the fantasies, finally exploded outward, as he continued tasting her body with his tongue. There was no technique, no hesitation, only a frantic, starving need to explore, to own, to consume. He felt like a man who had been wandering a desert for 20 years, finally stumbling upon an oasis. The hunger in him wasn't just sexual. It was a deep, spiritual starvation. For years, in his past life and in this miserable new one, he had been the background character, the nice guy, the cripple, the waste. But not now. Now he held a goddess-like beauty in his arms, and she was completely, utterly at his mercy. His hands roamed wildly, desperate to feel every inch of the prize he had stolen. His fingers dug into her stomach, tracing the lines of her soft, hot skin, her toned muscle, before sliding up to grip her soft boobs, kneading the unbelievably plush flesh until his knuckles turned white. And he still felt like he couldn't get close enough. He wanted to merge with her, to melt into her copper skin until he disappeared. So, not feeling satisfied enough, he commanded, "Turn around," his voice a wrecked husk of lust. She immediately spun in his arms, her movements fluid and obedient, her silver eyes shimmering in the low light, wide and sexy yet fixed on him with a terrifying adoration. MMMPH. Seeing this, he felt even more out of control and didn't even give her a moment to breathe and crashed his lips onto hers. Smack. Slurp. It wasn't a gentle kiss by any means. It was a collision of teeth and tongue. He pried her lips apart, invading her mouth, wrestling with her tongue, roaming around her cheeks, her palate. He kissed her with a messy, feverish passion, swallowing her whimpers, exchanging breath and saliva until he was dizzy. Still not feeling satisfied enough, he gently bit her lower lip, and she moaned into his mouth, the metallic tang of blood blooming on his tongue. Her arms wound around his neck, pulling him closer, her heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. But one taste was far from enough. He needed much more to really consume her. He broke the kiss with a wet gasp, saliva stringing between them, but he didn't pull away. Ha ha fuck. He panted against her face. His mouth moved frantically over her face, dropping wet, open-mouthed kisses on her eyelids, her temples, the high curve of her cheekbones. He licked the sheen of sweat from her skin, leaving a trail of friction burn that made her shiver. His tongue tracing the sharp line of her jaw before his teeth clamped down gently on her chin, earning a sharp intake of breath from her. "You taste incredible," he murmured against her skin, his teeth grazing it bruised. "MMMH," she gasped. He moved lower, burying his face in the curve of her neck again. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with her scent, the musky scent of a woman. He didn't just kiss her neck, he sucked hard on the tender skin over her pulse point, his lips creating a vacuum, pulling the blood to the surface. He nipped and bit at the cords of muscle, marking her, branding her with bruises that would last for days, marking her for everyone to see. She arched back due to intense simulation, her fingers digging into his scalp, pulling his hair, silently begging for more. His hands slowly dropped from feeling her back muscles to her wide, fertile hips. And of course, he didn't just touch them. He lavished them with a starving man's attention. His hands molded the soft flesh, lifting the weight of them, squeezing, kneading them into various shapes, hard enough to leave bruises. Slowly he moved a bit lower, leaving trails of heat on her skin, gripping her waist to hold her steady as he worshipped her body with a frantic intensity. He pressed his face between her heavy breasts, inhaling deeply, rubbing his cheeks against the soft, burnished copper skin, the softness of her boobs, feeling the heat radiating from her body. Hiss, ah! He groaned, the sound vibrating against her skin. He kissed the swell of her breasts, his stubble grazing the sensitive skin, making her hiss with pleasure. Finally, he captured one dark, hardened nipple in his mouth. Suck, pop. He sucked greedily, his tongue swirling around the pebbled texture. He scraped his teeth against the peak, gently at first, then harder, biting down until she screamed. AHH. Yes. She bucked against him, her legs shaking, her hands clutching his head to keep him there, trapped in his own starving devotion. /N. Next 10 chapters are going to be intense smut-focused. If you are here for that, then well, simply enjoy. Otherwise, just simply skip it, as even without that, it is a serious, gritty, and a real epic fantasy based in primitive world. Smut is just one of the many ingredients. Fair warning, don't think of it as some wish fulfillment. It is filled with ton-loads of action, adventures, wars, moments that will make you laugh, make you bawl your eyes out, root for MC, curse him, and many more exciting stuff.